This conference will now be recorded.
We're going to record it.
Hi all, sorry, like you just heard, we've just started the recording. We had a power outage that we're dealing with some technical problems, so we're gonna go ahead and record. We are gonna put out a message saying that public comment can be accepted by email. We're gonna push it so that people can submit public comment until tomorrow at 5 p.m. So they'll still have a chance after watching the meeting, which will be posted tomorrow morning. They'll still have a chance to provide comment that can be saved. I will go ahead and spare you all reading the emergency proclamation because it doesn't apply tonight, so you guys don't have to listen to me say that 5 times. We're ready whenever you are, Chair Boffman.
Okay, let's give this a try. So good evening, everyone. Welcome. Let's get started. This is the March 18th. Wow, is that right? March 18th, Sammamish Planning Commission meeting, and tonight we're going to be in one of our exciting sessions talking about development code. So let's get started here. Skipping over the meeting accessibility section, let's do roll call. I'll call your name. If you'd unmute yourself and say present or something and raise your hand, that'd be great. So I'm Mark Boffman, I'm present. Karthik Sitaraman.
Yes, present.
Mike Bresco.
Present.
TC Lobby. He's here. Josh Amato.
Here.
Karen Malcolm.
Here.
And Jackie, I was asking earlier, did Ratuja say she couldn't join until later?
No, I didn't receive, I haven't heard anything, so I'm not sure. So she might be joining us later because of the early start, but I'm not sure.
Because we're starting, if you're watching the recording, which I'm sure will cause the Nielsen ratings for the city's channel to skyrocket. If you're watching the recording of this, we are starting an hour earlier than normal at 5:30 because we have a lot to cover. All right. Thanks, everyone. Next is approval of the minutes from our March 4th meeting. Oh, I'm sorry. First, we have to approve the agenda. Does anyone have any comments about tonight's agenda? Pretty simple agenda. Great. We'll call the agenda approved by common consent. Next is approval of the minutes from March 4th. If you looked at the minutes from March 4th, is there any comments or corrections from those meeting minutes? Okay, seeing no comments, we'll call those meeting minutes approved by common consent. Normally, we would do our public comment at this point, but because of the technical difficulties and being unable to do public comment, we can't do that right now. I would encourage anyone who happens to be watching the recording of this that this topic around the development code is going to be ongoing for a while. So please, if you have comment, don't hesitate to forward it to the Planning Commission or join one of our other meetings and make comment at that time. We'd be glad to have it from you. Okay, so let's dive into our agenda item, which is further discussion about the revised development regulations and updates of the development regulations.
So Chair Boffman, this is David Pyle, Community Development. But before we get into this, I just wanted to offer a minute of explanation to the commission. We're trying a format here that we hope will work for you. We did realize after it was published and after we received several comments that the version that was pushed out did not include the strike draft. That was an error on our part, and I apologize for that. As I was explaining to the council on Tuesday night, this is a point in our work plan where we have so much going on that we are confronted with the risk of error. So it's an indication that we're stretched pretty thin. So I apologize for that happening. I also was out ill for the last few days and still not feeling very good. So I apologize if I'm seemingly a little groggy. But yet I have to attend the meeting, so here I am. And I have not been able to respond to comment because I was literally spent the day sleeping yesterday. So I really I've been catching up on a lot today, and I have not had a chance to respond to your comments thus far. So I apologize for that.
Understood. What I heard was tonight's the night to take advantage of David since he's not at his peak. Or maybe not. Let's go easy on him. Okay. So let's get started. Is this, oh, Karen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So these notes that we have that you sent to us, these have been gone through by the staff and they have already made changes to this. Is this correct? The older version has been corrected or amended by the staff, and now
So,
we're looking at it for a
so
third.
the version that was originally sent out as exhibit 2 with the packet included language that should have had strike draft in it, but it didn't. So it would have been the resultant, I believe, language. Jeff, I don't know, or Evan, if you can clarify for me. I think it's the equivalent of if you had accepted all changes. That's what you're seeing.
Okay.
What we had intended to send you was the actual red line strike draft version, so you could see where changes were being made.
Mhm.
So I think Evan was intending to send that out. I did just check the web link and tried to open the packet, and it is still the one with just the 2 exhibits. There's supposed to be a packet with a third exhibit that's being sent out. So hopefully, I believe Jeff in his presentation here tonight is going to walk through with you the version that includes the red line strike draft. So we'll be able to go through it, and you can see where those changes are being made.
Okay, that's helpful. I figured that's what this was, but I just wanted to make sure because some of it is so perfect that, we couldn't make any changes to it at this point as the commission. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, are you going to present something?
Yep, I'm going to share my, looks like I need control to be able to share my screen. And there we go. I got it. Thank you. Yep, thanks so much. So good evening, commissioners. I have in front of me a PDF that does have the strike draft in there. And hopefully this explanation up front made sense to you. There's a lot of moving parts to this, and different pieces of the code are in different kind of points in the process. So we just wanted to be crystal clear about each of the topics and sort of where they're at. We do have some measure of draft code for each of these sections. And as we went through and organized these, we kind of organized them from top to bottom based on our sense of those topics that we think would probably warrant the most discussion. So if it works for you, we can kind of just go down, give a brief overview, and then open it up for questions. I have also, like David said, received the comments that were submitted in writing. Some of those I have in front of me when we get to those topics. Others I'm still going through. So just wanted to make sure that you understand we will go through and address all those comments that were submitted. And if there are additional ones that come in after this meeting, we'll continue to compile those as well. So if we could start with, let's see here. Yep. Okay, that's got the strike draft. And this is a
zoom in and center it a little more. Thank
Yeah.
you. I just want to be able to make sure everybody can see. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And this program, I'm in a program called Bluebeam. So if we're talking and there's questions or changes, we can actually mark up this document as we're going through it. So the first topic is number 24. It's a really important topic for code. It deals with the conditional use standards as well as modifications to non-conforming structures and non-conforming uses. So those are things that predated this code. And like a lot of sections of the Sammamish code, this has remnants from when it was part of King County. And in our internal discussions with staff and of course looking at the code ourselves, it's pretty clear that there is some a number of sections that are either missing or others that are just really unclear and very difficult to interpret and administer. So we wanted to basically overhaul this section. And let me just go through a couple of examples and narratives that we have here in the table. So obviously a non-conforming structure can be non-conforming in different ways. Very typical non-conformity is it's within the setback. That's a common example. And then codes would have standards for how that structure could be expanded. If a structure has a 10-foot setback and it's 5 feet, some cities might let you continue that 5 feet in the expansion. Others would make you comply with the 10-foot for any addition to that structure. So that's one example. The other is conditional uses. Sometimes there are what would be conditional uses under the code, but they have not actually gone through the conditional use process. And this can create confusion for the staff in how to deal with that, because the conditional use process, as I'm sure you're aware, can be quite onerous. And so at what point does that trigger going through that process versus some minor changes? So that's another one. And also with a non-conforming use, so a use that's not allowed in the code, but predated the current code. Sometimes those uses, aren't necessarily having a negative impact, and that business may need to make a very minor addition. It might be something to meet a code requirement or a public health requirement. So oftentimes, even though it's a non-conforming use, cities will have some allowances for how to expand that. So a couple of questions that we pose for the Planning Commission. Should expansions of non-conforming structures have to meet all applicable codes? Back to that example with the setback, if your building's within the setback, you want to expand it, that expansion would have to meet it under the proposed language that we've included in the code today. So we would like to hear from you on that. And then the second question we had was, should there be minor allowances to expansions of non-conforming uses when it is necessary for the operation of the business and to meet certain codes, fire, life safety codes, public health codes, and that would be determined by the city at the time of application. So I'll just scroll down here a little bit, and just so now you can see when you have a chance to review this, there is now strike draft in there, so you can see where we've removed code and where we've added code. We've structured this, no pun intended, to, again, anything that's built new really should conform to the code. There are some minor allowances for that, but the way that we've written it now, you're expanding your building, it's got to meet the code, at least for that expansion piece of it. Another one deals with, well, I'm just going to cover structures here for a second. When a non-conforming structure is destroyed by fire. Sorry, let me go up top a little bit. Yeah, this section right here. So it deals with the reestablishment of a damaged or destroyed non-conforming structure. And there wasn't a lot of great guidance. And this is a pretty typical standard. If your building is damaged, but it's less than 50% of the value, meaning there's still more value than not from that, then you can restore that building in its same footprint with the same degree of nonconformity. If that structure is then destroyed above 50% of the value of the structure and it has to be rebuilt, it would have to comply with all the setbacks. If that was not possible, then they would have an option to go and seek a variance and have to meet those criteria. Last thing I want to cover, and then I'll open it up for questions and comments. Non-conforming uses. This is, as you can see, a mostly new section. Couple things that are made clear here. You can't go from a non-conforming use to another non-conforming use. Some cities will allow you to do that, but it seems kind of contrary to the code. And then there are the time limits for reestablishing a non-conforming use. And one of those criteria is that, if a non-conforming use becomes vacant, let's say you have a restaurant and it's not allowed in that zone, that restaurant goes out of business. If that owner is actively leasing, seeking to lease that space, that would not count for that 12-month period. If the time period that use is not established exceeds 12 months, then it would lose the right to that use, and any new use would have to comply. And then the last one, again, is some very minor, 10% or 500 square feet, whichever less, if it's something that's, related to sort of the essential operation of that business and certain codes. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or comments.
This is Karthik. I have one question. This is going to be a very dumb question. Can you give me examples of non-conforming use? I can understand the non-conforming structure, but I'm not sure I understand non-conforming use.
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. Let's say, under King County zoning, before the city was incorporated, there was a neighborhood store. And the city, when they created their zoning, identified that as a residential district, right? It only allows residential use, but that store is still there. That would be considered a non-conforming use. You couldn't go and establish that use now, but it doesn't sort of require them to stop operating that business at that time. So there are usually limits on what can happen to it, but it can continue to operate legally until certain time period of it not being in operation occurs.
Thank
It's
you.
actually a really good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Josh has some questions.
Yeah, I just to help speed things along. Should I ask? I submitted some grammatical things, but for example, this question. Tell me if I should just wait on these in the future until you respond in text, or if I should ask these during the meeting. Two questions I submitted were, how is the value determined? Who determines what the value is for the destruction? And then on the 12-month clock, the case litigation could be something that precludes someone from maybe starting a rebuild. So how is that? How do we take those things into consideration?
Yeah, good questions.
And again, if I should just wait until the staff are able to talk about those, I can hold the question that I've already submitted.
So there's a standardized residential value calculator or structure value calculator that anybody can use. And it's free for the entry level version. You can buy a professional version. In my experience in Bellevue, we had a similar set of rules compared to what Jeff has put together here. And we had applicants use that tool to calculate it. If they objected to it, then they could prepare a professional appraisal, structure appraisal, and we would accept that as well. So, it's something that's workable for us. At the end of the day, we're not in this to try and nitpick exact values, although sometimes it does come down to that. And we have had scenarios where in Bellevue where we had to hire our own third-party assessor or appraiser to appraise the value as well, right? And then we ended up settling the issue between the different appraisers. But the issue here that's really, I think, the policy question for the commission, and Jeff did a really good job framing this for you, is we are at a tipping point as a city, and if we continue to allow some of these older buildings that are remnants of our past to remain in perpetuity, we as a city since incorporation have been very liberal with non-conforming structures and uses. And we're at a point where we're seeing infill and a density at a level where we probably need to reconsider our approach. And if you think that we should be requiring renovations to incorporate life safety improvements, and if you think that we should be requiring renovations or building additions to step back and follow the setbacks for that addition, we're not saying tear down the part of the building with an addition that's non-conforming and move it. We're saying if you have a non-conforming building and you want to add on to it, you have to meet the setback for the addition, right? And that's really the policy question is, should patterns of the past be allowed to continue in perpetuity, or should modifications to patterns of the past be required to come into compliance with rules of today on some varying level?
Good one. I'm sorry, Josh, could you repeat the second part of your question or your second question?
The second part of my question was on the clock, the 12-month for reestablishing. But given the redirection on the policy questions, there will be plenty of time for us to nitpick on the details of the language. So I would rather just wait, and we'll get to that later, I think.
Okay. That is a really good question. I have seen that come up in a historic structure where it was subject to an arson investigation. So that can be an issue, and I do think the city, depending on their interest in the issue, would have some flexibility in terms of how that clock is calculated. And I think litigation, would certainly be something to consider. Okay, other questions, comments?
I've got one. So for 21A 70.70 here, line 2. Yeah.
Okay.
So if a structure containing a non-conforming use is damaged or destroyed, may be reestablished within 12 months. Are we stipulating that it may be reestablished within 12 months by the original occupant? Or would somebody else be able to reestablish another non-conforming use business in that same space?
I'll give my take, and then David, you can weigh in if you feel differently. Usually these kind of things run with the land. So I would think that regardless of the owner, it could fall under these rules. Even if it was, say the property was sold and a new owner reestablished it, I believe that would comply.
I agree. That's the way I've seen it applied. And actually, we have a very similar set of rules in our shoreline rules in the city, which are part of the Shoreline Master Program. So this proposed change is more in line with what we already have on the books for our Shoreline Master Program for those shoreline properties.
Okay.
Other comments, TC? Anyone else?
I have a question on the second topic in front of the commission. I think I want to understand what is the minor. Can you scroll to the two topics that is in front of the commission? It's the top, I guess. So yeah, thank you. So minor allowances, what are they? Who will determine whether an allowance is minor or major? Because we are trying to explain things here. I don't want us to introduce languages that could be misinterpreted again. So that's my concern with that question.
Yeah, good question. We would have criteria. Let me see if we've added that piece yet.
I would actually add to that, Jeff, and just say that the words minor and major, especially minor, are used in a bunch of different places in here. And I think we should just put some attention towards being careful about, if we're going to say that, then we define it someplace. And I think it looks like, especially now that I see some of this redlining, that some of that's been done, but we really need to be careful about that.
Yeah, I agree. Good. That's a great point. Okay. So I think we do need to still define minor for the purposes of the conditional use. So we will add that in.
Well, even just in the concept of under preferred solution, you use the words, minor improvements. And I think, again, it's just the concept of being cautious about, even though that's not the code, I get it, but it defines kind of a concept of that we start to head down a path where we talk minor and major, but there has to be more clear definition for people in the future to be able to use.
Yep, I agree. I think what we would do for that issue around the conditional use would be something here, like this is what we would aim for, where if we use the term minor, we're actually defining it. So here it's 10% or 500 square feet. And I think we probably would use a similar metric for the conditional use piece as well. So we'll make sure, and I've got a note for that. Great point.
So in the event that anyone's interested, the estimator, I just heard back from one of my past coworkers in Bellevue, the estimator that they use is called Marshall and Swift. I would propose that we use something like that. If you look it up online, it's called the Swift estimator. It's a pretty amazing online tool that you can use to establish building value, just so you know what we're talking about.
Great. And the building official could review that as well, right, David?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So one more question. I don't know if Sammamish has historic buildings here. Typically, those won't be non-conforming. They'll have a lot of code violations having been built a long time back. Are those, will those come under these rules also, or are they completely excluded from these rules? I mean,
So,
maybe a moot point for Sammamish not having any historic building, but still.
If a building was considered to be a landmark, and as far as I'm aware, we have just a few landmarks in the city. If the building was considered to be a landmark, it would be accepted from these. If a building is considered to be an historic resource, that status doesn't really provide any protection. Although that's something we could consider adding into this, is that for historic resources or landmarks, they are allowed to be replaced up to 100% of their value, or maintained and replaced, something like that. If you think that's appropriate.
I would wait for my colleagues to comment.
Yeah, I think I would just say anything that is historic in some objective way, right? You can't just have a group that says it's historic, but if it's historic in some objective way, then yeah, it should be. There should be some special allowances for that.
Do we have a role of historic, non-conforming, or historic use buildings within the city limits?
We do, and it's actually defined under Title 21, and we actually have a historic resources inventory, and we work with the Sammamish Heritage Society, and we actually just recently have a memorandum of understanding with the Sammamish Heritage Society, and they serve in an official capacity to help us maintain that list of historic resources. So what we could do is we could reference out to Title 21 here in this location, which would say any structure or place recognized as an historic resource or listed as a landmark is accepted from this section.
Mike, I think you had some questions or comments, didn't you?
Yeah, I had two comments. One is actually a comment on, there seems like there's some definitional things, like historical use might be one, value, minor. And I'm wondering if there's a place in the code that would kind of overarch and sort of definitionally that's early on in the code, this is what these mean. So that might be something that might be considered. And then the other was just looking at the policy questions and the strategy notes. I like the way those are stated, that basically what we're working towards is to have conformance to the code. And the reason for that is that, what I feel personally, what I hear about the, kind of the feel, the look, the character of Sammamish has to do with, or would be negatively impacted if we continue to allow non-conformances. So I agree with the strategy notes and the approach taken from a policy perspective.
So I wanted to ask Jeff, so did I understand this right? If somebody has, and I don't even know how likely this is, but it seems possible. If someone has a house that was built in the late 80s or early 90s, and it's a non-conforming because it's 1 foot too close to the property line, or I don't know, whatever. It's in an area where they have too much non-impermeable surface because of the house or something, and it burns to the ground. They can't rebuild that house.
They can rebuild it, but they would be required to comply with the code at that point. So if it was 1 foot too close to the street, then they would have to push it back 1 foot. If it was over on impervious surface, they would have to comply with the current code, or they could go through the variance process and they could get an exception. But if there was no sort of justification for a variance, which are typically pretty difficult to achieve, they would have to comply with the code, the current code in place.
I guess that kind of leads to my overarching comment about this. We actually got a little bit of public comment, written public comment about it, but I think we should, and I've said this in the past and I'll probably say it in the future and you guys can roll your eyes, but I think we should be very cautious about how these rules apply to single family homes with, an existing resident who, somebody who's really already a citizen of Sammamish and they're trying to do something. There should be absolutely rules and requirements for that, absolutely. But I think there should be a little leeway around that. So to me, somebody whose house that they've lived in for 20 years and then it burns down and now we tell them, well, you can't rebuild that house. And you can say, oh yeah, push it a foot back, but sometimes that's not that simple. And some of the places where things have been built around the city, and to tell somebody they can't rebuild their house, I think that's not really what we're trying to do. And maybe that's such a narrow example that it's not really worth considering. But in general, I think we do need to be cautious of, if we're talking about a business or some kind of a institutional use or something like that, that's one situation. But when we're talking about a single family home and someone that homeowner is trying to do or figure out, that might need to have a little bit of a different view of how these rules get applied, because I think it would be unfortunate to create difficulty and harm to those residents and citizens, because there's others who are certainly more able and capable of complying and know what they're doing and need to follow some rules, versus just a family that's trying to figure out how to deal with a deck or whatever it is. So that's an overarching comment. That's not just this one, that's many of these. I do think I still believe that we should do a little bit more paying attention to that. I like the single family and large scale. The hesitation I have there is single family doesn't really, and maybe the code can't do this, but single family could be a developer who comes in and builds 3 single family houses. If we don't define that more narrowly or think about how it's defined more narrowly, that's still different than an existing resident who's doing something on their property, and that they're not trying to subdivide, they're not trying to, build the world, they're just trying to do something with their property. That's different than some of this other stuff.
If your example pertains to somebody that's trying to rebuild after a loss, doesn't that fall under the reestablishment of a non-conforming? So they have 12 months to kind of get started with it, right? They can, as long as they're not changing the square foot or the layout or something like that, if they're simply and that's reestablishing, and they have 12 months to get rolling on that. Is that,
Yeah, except that
misinterpreting?
Right, the language right here in 3 says non-conforming structures damaged exceeds 50% of the value may only be reconstructed if the reconstruction complies with all code requirements.
Yeah.
There's no daylight there.
Yeah, the section that you were looking at, TC, was related to the non-conforming uses. So
Got it.
Really, really good comments there. And I think that is the policy question. And I certainly have seen, cities take a different approach with single family homes. So there's a couple of options here. You could exempt existing single family homes from these requirements and allow reconstruction as long as it isn't more non-conforming, right? So you can basically build in the same footprint. The other thing that you could do is you could have the default be that you have to reconstruct and comply with the code, but then you could have something that's less than a variance, and you could have criteria that could be determined by the city. So those would be kind of your 3 options: exempt, a single family home or any other types of uses or structures have kind of the default that you have to comply in the reconstruction, but actually have like a waiver process with some criteria that wouldn't be as onerous as a variance, or what we've proposed here, which would be the strictest rules, which would require you to comply with the code in the reconstruction or seek a variance through the hearing examiner.
So what about exempting a single family residence where there's no change in ownership, right? So if somebody's rebuilding what they lost, then it's a much easier path than if there's a loss and somebody buys the empty property and then comes in to redevelop it.
I think that would be possible. I mean, we might want to check in with legal on that. I mean, sometimes, you know, it can be more legally challenging if you're making a difference between ownership. But I think that's something that we could explore, and you know, maybe something that we could move forward with.
So the one for us that's the most typical issue that we hear about in plan review and in construction from neighbors and from builders and property owners is with regard to someone has an existing home on an existing lot that is shaped a certain way, and it's not conforming to the setbacks of today. It conforms to the setbacks of 2002, but it doesn't conform to today's setbacks. And they want to do an addition on the side of their house, and they have a bump out on their house that already basically gets them to 5 feet from the property line. What they want to do is go fill in the area along the line and maintain that existing setback of 5 feet. And we hear from neighbors that they don't appreciate that they wish that would have been pushed back to match the current setbacks of today. But we hear from the property owners that they really appreciate that because it allowed them to add on to their house in a way that made sense for their floor plan. So it's this sort of point of tension of you know, rules of the past versus expectations of today. And that's really what we're after here, is trying to understand from the commission whether or not we should be making a policy change going forward, where we are now favoring the rules of today over the rules of the past. And that's because right now the way it works is we are really forgiving with non-conforming development. We allow you to basically tear down and rebuild the house in almost its same place. And we allow you to maintain the setbacks, and we allow it, if it burns down, you can put it back where it is. If it was destroyed by an act of nature, then you could put it back where it is. And some people argue that if it's been removed to the point where you have to rebuild it, well, then that is the right time to make it conform to the rules of today. Some people argue that. Other people argue that you had it a certain way. It wasn't your fault that it was destroyed, so you should be allowed to put it back how it was. So I think the main question, if we could direct our attention to that question and not get too wrapped up in the text here, I think we would be better suited. And if we could get sort of a firm direction about how the commission wants us to proceed with nonconformities, it would be really helpful.
Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I think it's pretty common in other places that, you know, if you want to do something, you have to abide by the current code because that's the safest, that's the most environmentally friendly. And yes, you were able to exist with the previous, but this is now, and we know a lot more now. And I think it's very common, and I would agree that they should have to upgrade.
Yeah, I tend to agree as well. We're not walking around trying to find people and make them conform to current code, but if there's some sort of compelling event that is triggering this, then the current standard should be in play.
Yeah, I'll add also, so I commented earlier about, I think it's important to conform to the current code. I did in the conversation like the idea about sort of not necessarily having to get a variance, but a waiver. It makes it slightly easier. And my thinking there is that we want to, even in some of these cases like what Chair Bachman brought up, that we want the homeowner to be motivated to comply, unless it's onerous and they're really looking for a way to have a waiver, not as complex as a variance if that's possible. But I do think it's important to have the bias leaning toward conformance to the latest codes rather than going back to codes from 2002.
On the question of an addition to the house, staying with a non-conforming use, I would move towards making them comply. So not allowing them to be within, extend their footprint inside of the setback. But in the case of a single family home or primary residence being burnt down or destroyed, I'm not a fan of not allowing them to rebuild in the current footprint they have. Especially if they can't configure it in a way where they maintain the same square footage and potentially lose value from what they had originally purchased. So I think it would be good if we could find a way to take that into consideration, maybe steer them towards the path of conforming and then some form of less than a variance if we need to, for allowing them to have a home that maintains same value. I don't think pushing them towards conforming if they end up with a house worth less money makes sense. Some of these houses that are non-conforming, if you make them conform, they're going to lose quite a bit of money in square footage loss. So that's something I want to consider.
Just a wrap on my comment is I think as long as there's a path for someone who's really stuck between a rock and a hard place trying to sort it out, as long as there's a path that staff can utilize and work with a property owner to get there. Maybe it's a little bit difficult. As long as there's a path, I think then that's fine.
So I have one more comment. What if, non-conformity was the cause of the destruction, right? Would you still want them to kind of build the same structure? That is my thought process, one of them. Second thing is, I heard Chair Mark and Josh talk about monetary value. Should that play into the decision-making process of, making people conform or not? Or should safety and why these codes were enacted in the first place be the driving factor here, right? Should we be putting the monetary value as even a decision factor? Is not something I agree with. But I think the codes are there for a place. So I think we should move towards, if a structure is non-conforming structure is destroyed, we should move towards the new structure being conformant. That is the thought that I have.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest unless someone has a burning passion for this, maybe we should move to the next topic.
But let me just summarize real quick. I think kind of the direction we're heading. It sounds like we'd like to have something short of a variance, a waiver for single-family homes only, and develop some criteria that would allow for some replacement with some degree of nonconformity, and we could bring that back to you in the next draft for consideration, as well as integrating some considerations for historic structures as well. Good. Great. Okay. So this next one, topic 16, and we have gone ahead and combined this with 9 and 14 because they address the same sections of code. So 16, developers are willing to pay fines for violating code provisions or construction management requirements. So, the fines in that sense are not a deterrent. The preferred solution is to enhance the city's ability to issue stop work orders and changing fines. And in some cases, if they're doing something that's not consistent with the permit, they'd actually have to reapply for a new permit. Problem examples and narrative: the ability to enforce against violations during construction and particularly to minimize impacts on the neighborhood is a central theme for these updates. Examples include constructing a project in conflict with the approved permit, which could be any number of things. Buildings not in the right footprint, setback issues, lot coverage, whatever it may be. Failing to maintain erosion control fencing, which is a really big issue, obviously a really important issue in the city of Sammamish. And impacting critical areas and buffers. That could be, storing your construction materials in a wetland buffer or something like that, and removing trees without approval. Questions for the commission: are the proposed modifications to fines appropriate? And we got a couple of questions on this topic from the commissioners before, which we could discuss. And are the proposed amounts for financial guarantees to ensure permit obligations are followed through? Are there other project elements that require financial guarantees? And in many cases, these fines could be applied, daily. So they could start to become cumulative in that sense. From talking with staff extensively about this, if someone's working in good faith, they'll have an opportunity to comply. But in cases where it's obvious that, this is just a way to get out of the requirements or whatnot, we really want to make sure that the fines are doing their purpose, which is not necessarily to generate money, but is to ensure compliance with the code, and certainly in many cases to minimize environmental damage as well as property damage to streets and adjacent properties. So I'll stop there.
I have a couple of clarifying questions, please. Up in the box at the top, the preferred solution, what is a field correction?
Yeah, so that's something that is minor enough that an inspector could come out and improve it in the field. So you don't have to go back and reapply or submit a formal amendment. It's something that's done in the field. It's pretty typical with building inspectors, for example. Again, it's something minor enough that could be approved in the field and signed off on by the inspector.
Okay. Second question, kind of a dumb one, but is the building official, is that the inspector?
David, do you want to answer that? I mean, certainly one of them.
Sure. The building official is ultimately the responsible official for implementation of the city's building codes. That individual is responsible for making interpretations of the code, making decisions about application of the building code, dealing with questions or clarifications around application of the building code. Really, everything to do with the building code is routed first through the building official, and then I end up supervising the building official. So if there are further questions, they would end up coming to me after that.
So it is not the inspector, it's somebody on staff who has a pretty good knowledge base.
Yeah, the building inspector, if they were presented with a question or they had something they couldn't answer, would then take it to the building official, who likely would convene some sort of a group. We maintain a building division group that meets regularly to resolve issues that arise out in the field or in plan review. So first they would do an internal vetting of the issue, and if they couldn't reach resolution, they then would either engage a consultant to help with it, who might have extensive building experience and qualifications, or depending on the nature of the question or issue, they would engage myself or legal counsel on it.
Okay, all right.
Can I just ask though, David? I mean, depending on how the language is written, if it's an enforcement issue of silt fence or something like that, I mean, I think that the contractors might view the inspector as the building official. We're not, if the language is written with those terms, that would maybe be a consideration. We shouldn't look at it that every little tiny thing has to go back to you or somebody else. Whoever's out there doing the inspection frequently has the authority to ask for corrections for those kinds of minor on the fly type things.
Yes, and it's a judgment call. and we work regularly with our staff to train and calibrate them in making those decisions.
I would like to go ahead then and comment on the financial guarantee, the erosion control, $500. That doesn't seem like enough money to me. $500 is nothing when you're building a $500,000 house. So I would suggest that we make something a little stiffer there.
I would agree with that one.
I think that there should be some level of, I guess, parity between the potential fine and what the guarantee is.
So the purpose of the guarantee, we have three opportunities here to engage the applicant. The first is we have that intervention opportunity that I talk about, where we're able to work with them and try and convince them of the importance of these components of building, site clearing limits, vegetation, tree protection, erosion control methods. All of these things are really important, and we want to work with them to make sure that they understand how important they are. The next thing we can do is we can require they put in place a performance agreement and a financial guarantee. And what that's saying is that they're committing to maintaining the erosion control and the clearing limits, and that they're then putting down money on it. And the amount of money that we require, I think, this is the dial or the lever that you could move as a commission. You could say, hey, we think it's really important that a builder take this seriously, so we think they should put down a $3,000 bond financial guarantee that says they're going to follow the limits. Well, that's all good for a commercial builder. They'll get their attention. But what about an individual who's just trying to build a house, right? Are they then required to come in with that? Well, we have problems with both categories of builders, whether it's a professional builder, a once in a while builder, or a property owner in the city that's trying to build. I think that all categories are problematic for us at times. So really, we're just trying to get their attention. Then finally, the last opportunity we have is when they're actually building it and we're inspecting it. And if they aren't implementing it or maintaining it properly, then we would stop their project and we would require that they come in with a correction. And until they get it right, we're not going to let them continue.
Right, but that financial guarantee, when do you decide that the city keeps it or the company keeps it, the builder?
I think this is, part of it is, Jeff probably has some ideas on this, but this is the fine tuning of how this works.
Mm-hmm.
The concept for us is, do we want to have tools in our code that would get the builder's attention and help us help them be more compliant and actually follow the plan that's approved?
Right.
Maybe I'd offer, though, my perception of how this works is a bond. If somebody has to post a bond, if they have no violations and there's a time period when it's determined that there's no violations, then the bond is released. And so the cost to them is zero, or whatever the cost to the bonding issuer was. So yeah, that's a pretty good tool, because that bond can be called if they've had violations. And there's all kinds of nuance to that, I'm sure. But yeah, that's a pretty good tool to do it. And yeah, I mean, even if a homeowner wants to build a house and they have to post a bond to make sure that their builder doesn't create problems, that doesn't seem unreasonable.
We could also differentiate the fee in a couple of different ways. You could do it by use, right? So a single family home is different than a commercial property. You could also do the financial guarantee based on, say, the linear feet of erosion control fence. That might be a way to sort of address, erosion control for, say, a large, school site or commercial site, something that's large versus a very small, smaller single family lot.
I guess the other question I have, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Jeff, I'd be really cautious about that because, and the reason why is because, then you end up kind of forcing a city official, somebody, an inspector or somebody to argue about whether it's this 50 feet or that 50 feet or 10 feet, or well, I'm going to go out there and measure it and it's not that much. I don't know. Violation is violation, and you got to give people a little bit of judgment. And if there's somebody out there that's not trying and not complying, I don't care if it's 10 feet or 1,000 feet. If they're not trying, if they're not making the effort, then they're in violation. But if they have something that's a little out and they run right over there and they fix it, well, I think probably an inspector can use some judgment about that. But I wouldn't create situations that invite arguing over how many feet it is or how extensive it is or whatever.
Yeah, I was more meaning how much erosion control fence they have to install, right? So the risk, let's say you have to install, 500 feet of erosion control fence versus, 50 feet for a home. The risk is greater, if more has to be installed, not just the amount that's in violation. That was sort of what I was getting at.
Sure. Of course, some erosion control up next to the lake is pretty critical, and some that's just next to the drainage ditch is, I don't know.
Yeah.
That it seems to be, I think it is a real relevant problem that's commonly a violation. So that needs to have some teeth in it.
Okay.
I interrupted you, Karen. I apologize. Go ahead, please.
No, that's fine. I guess my question is, what happens, let's say somebody doesn't comply with the fence and there is some erosion. Do we go back in then and use that bond money to fix the erosion problem? And how does that work? I mean, isn't that the purpose of it?
I think that's accommodated for in the assessment schedule, wherein, so when we get down to the assessment schedule, we see things like environmental damage, critical area violations, up to $25,000 plus the cost of restoration or remediation. So,
okay.
Yeah, as they were saying, that it seems like there are multiple avenues that we have, and this is really the financial guarantee is meant to draw attention to how serious the city is about enforcing this, so that it's not overlooked at the onset. That being said, I would be in favor of a larger financial guarantee for erosion control.
So as I'm looking, part of the challenge that we're addressing is that some developers would be willing to break the rules because it wouldn't be that much of a cost compared to the value that they're getting from building the property. So I think there should be some multiplier or calculation put in place based on the anticipated value of the development that's being put in place, because someone who's building many, a big project will likely be more willing to break a rule that has, $1,000. Well, it doesn't matter. Perhaps some sort of multiplier in there for the value of the development.
Good idea.
Because I think it's really difficult to know if these fines make sense because there are so many variables that go into each development.
Well, there is an example in number C. It's 2,000 per acre.
Right.
Would we be able to do the financial guarantee per parcel or some other means? I think it would kind of bridge the gap, right? If you try and tie it to the perceived value of the project at its completion compared to the total number of units or something like that being developed, right? It helps you get to where you want, where if you're developing more units, you're going to put more financial guarantee in.
Mm-hmm. The building permits are scaled based on value, so you could use a similar metric
Okay.
To, because it's already built into the system. So you could simply, use the value of the structure, as a multiplier for that. And we could take a look at that.
Yeah, I definitely think that there needs to be something to equate for the economy of scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Does this apply to, for example, in the 1,500 per inch of diameter for a tree removed or damaged? Does that apply to just somebody going out with a chainsaw on their property one Saturday and cutting the tree down, or is that addressed in a different section of the code?
Addressed in Title 23.
Yeah, correct. This would be like if you had let's say you had a subdivision and you wanted to protect, you had a clearing and grading limits based on the open space you're providing, and that's protected, right? And you have an acre of that, then you'd have to pay 10,000. So as David said, if you just go out and preemptively cut down trees, it's covered in the other section for fines.
So I had a question on the tree protection, 1,000 per tree. Is the city going to go and count the trees, or are we going to just take what the developer says or the number of trees in, and just calculate it?
It's not uncommon for the applicant to have to provide the specific number of trees and locations of ones that are protected. I certainly have seen that. I don't know if David can speak to specific examples in Sammamish, but yeah.
We require it. Every permit that comes in the door has to have an analysis regarding their site plan regarding trees and tree retention, tree retention and tree preservation. Recently in Sammamish is a big deal. Historically, it has not been a big deal. We have a new tree code that was put in place in 2016, I want to say, 21A37, and it's one of the most restrictive sets of tree rules in the region. So we do take it very seriously. Staff are very well trained in what to look for on site plans. It's not to say that things don't get missed still. We're not perfect. But what this here would enable us to do is we commonly have scenarios where a builder will take down the tree protection fencing and stack a pile of lumber there, or we'll do something in the tree protection area. And what it would enable us to do is to stop work them and also take the money in the bond and under the performance agreement and put back up the tree protection on their behalf, because they already have a bond in place. And we actually have other scenarios and other types of work, like site clearing for large projects. We have a site restoration bond that builders are required to put in place, and we have actually taken those in the past when we've had a project that has stalled out for some reason, and we've used those to restore the site. So the idea there is that if they're not performing in accordance with the performance agreement, then we end up taking the bond per the terms of the performance agreement and then doing the work ourselves, hiring a contractor and going out and doing the work ourselves. That's the idea here.
Got it. Thank you.
Can I ask a couple of questions? And maybe I should know this for the city of Sammamish. Do we require a separate construction management plan as part of the permitting process? So a plan that describes their haul routes and the way they're going to keep from tracking dirt out onto the street, and some of those kinds of things that we're talking about here?
So we do require a construction stormwater pollution prevention plan, the CSWIP. The CSWIP is not necessarily a site management plan or a mobilization plan. We would like to add to the code exactly what you described, Chair Boffman. So that's one of our goals here, is to more comprehensively ask questions of an applicant about how are you going to get supplies in? Where's your haul route going? All those things that you described are really important, and we historically as a city, have not asked for that from applicants.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's common with larger cities, and it's, at least if you have something like that, even in a basic form, it's a good, to me, it seems like some people won't like having to create it, but it's a good tool to measure whether there's compliance or not, because if they've described it, then they have to live up to it. So I think that that would be a good way to address some of the things that we're talking about here. My other comment or question is, I'm trying to envision exactly how some of this would work, and from a practical standpoint, because there are certainly developers who then essentially hire subcontractors or even a general contractor and a series of subcontractors to do all the work. And it's pretty easy to have a concrete contractor and a framing contractor and a mechanical contractor, and pretty easy for the developer to not supervise adequately. And as a result, a lot of the violations during the construction process are not really the developer, they're the contractors. Is it clear, or will the language be clear that the party that we're holding accountable is the entity submitting the permit, and in most cases that's going to be the developer, so that there's not potential for blame and finger pointing and trying to get out of the situation because they're not the ones that, actually doing the work. They're not the ones storing the lumber in the wrong place or whatever, but they still need to be, even if they're not designated as the general contractor of the project, they still need to be the obligation, the party that's obligated and therefore financially obligated. Is that clear, or is there any wiggle room there?
I mean, that's how I think it would work by default. But we've also talked about in another section, potentially at some point having like business license requirements. That could be another form of enforcement activity. So if you have, say, a subcontractor who's committing violations for multiple developers and is clearly a bad actor, even though they wouldn't necessarily get the fine in that sense, they might get it as a pass-through. But they wouldn't be necessarily directly fined by the city. I think we would, as a city, we'd still want to know that and perhaps have some ways to prevent that entity from working in the city. So it's one thing that we've been talking about in a different topic.
Sure. Yeah, I just would want to make sure that if we're trying to create a structure that holds someone accountable, that there's not any room for them to try to avoid being accountable. So okay, that's it.
We'll add that in and make it more clear. It's a good suggestion. So we'll reference the applicant and owner at that point.
Other comments on this topic?
With regards to the assessment schedule, what is the purpose of the non-compliance maximum penalty? Why would we cap that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a piece of existing code. But we could certainly take that out. I mean, you would have to, yep, go ahead, David.
If I recall right, there's a legal reason for that, and we'd have to check with our legal counsel. I think that part of it is it typically when something's non-compliant, if there's a life safety issue or if there's an environmental degradation issue, and usually there is an interim step to button it up, clean it up, or halt whatever's happening, and then usually it ends up going to the hearing examiner in court. So if the site remains non-compliant and we can't keep assessing fines while it's in process for what resolution will be brought, right? So I think part of it also is that the city can say somebody's not compliant or out of compliance and issue a code enforcement action against them, but the city is not always right, and there's a due process that they're given that allows them to rebut what the city says, and I think that's part of it. I'd have to check with legal and look at the history about why there's a cap on that.
Can we could the cap be put on an occurrence, right? If there's one thing that makes them non-compliant and they're non-compliant for 20 days and they remediate that, but then they go non-compliant on something else, do they have the ability to say, well, I've already paid 20 days of non-compliance. I've only got 31 left until I hit my max, right? Does it trigger a new timer because this is a new violation?
In that scenario, I would say yes.
Agree.
Okay, anyone else?
So one thing to keep in mind in the background as you go forward, and this, I'll just say this with the code enforcement stuff, is we have a separate work plan that you'll be seeing later this year to completely rewrite Title 23. So we're not trying to get in here and really tinker with 23 too much, because there's a lot more at play here with 23, Title 23. So what we're trying to do is surgically change some of these assessments to match what we're doing in Title 16. So these are related amendments, but we're not actually looking to open up Title 23 because there is a much larger work plan that will take us several planning commission meetings just looking at Title 23. So I know you're all excited for that in the future, but it is coming your way.
Okay. It's been suggested that we maybe take a 5-minute break before we move on. Is anyone opposed to that? Okay, so let's, my watch says, what does my watch say? My smartwatch isn't too smart at the moment.
6:45, reconvene at 6:50.
6:44, so 6:50. Yep, 6:50.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you much.
Hello.
Okay, let's get started again.
Okay. So we're now on topic 9, which is also addressed with 16. Compliance and enforcement of existing code regulations is challenging given the current code provisions. Wait, is this the one we just did? Sorry. Addresses some of the same topics. Erosion control fencing. I think we might have already addressed most of this one in the above. Just make sure here. Yeah, we addressed this one already in the text above because it's part of that one. So let me go down to the next one. 20. This is an interesting topic. So 20 is noticing requirements are not well organized and could be clearer. The solution is to modernize the city's permit noticing requirements to reflect new methods of outreach, such as website posting. So one, I think, fairly easy change is rather than referencing the newspaper of record, we would post these notices on city website and kind of have a easy location where people could find all of the public notices for development. But interested in your feedback on that, whether you think there's any value in putting it in the paper. And then the other one that we talked about quite a bit with the advisory group, noticing requirements for minor applications. So those that are type 1 do not have adequate noticing requirements. So in some cases, this could be an infill project on an existing lot, but maybe as a challenging site. And those types of applications we have heard from stakeholders can have significant impacts on the neighborhood during construction, and there's not always broad awareness of what's happening and good communication between the applicant, developer, and the neighbors. So we wanted to look at some options for enhancing the noticing as well as the ongoing communication. And so our question for the commission, does the planning commission agree there should be improved noticing requirements for type 1 permits, which are typically things like single family homes? Again, they may not be exactly like for a big commercial site, say with large notice boards, but we were thinking about designing something a little smaller scale that could be used for smaller projects like single family homes, but would have some notice on the property, as well as requiring the applicant to set up some form of communication where neighbors could sort of opt in to getting at least weekly updates on, today we're going to be pouring the foundation, there's going to be trucks in these locations. So there's sort of an ongoing two-way communication. And I think we talked with the community advisor group, eventually if the city could facilitate the development of some sort of online platform that could allow that, that might be something that it could evolve into. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions, comments.
Go ahead, TC, are you have some comments?
I was going to say, I think that the idea of, being able to kind of track what's happening within the city at any given time is a really good idea. I don't know, we don't have a lot of kind of industry here, so understanding the where and the why of material trucks and things like that is beneficial.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea to have improved noticing requirements. The website is definitely a good tool. It can also, I think the language should say something about the notice being conspicuous, because it's really easy to, for something to be difficult to find on a website. And I think the regular updates for homeowners about what's happening at a site, in a week or whatever makes sense. I don't know how necessary it is though. So feedback from the city about how many calls they get when a development's going on for a single family home related to what's happening, why is there noise today, might make sense. Otherwise it could be just an onerous requirement that doesn't provide that much benefit to the general public. So in general, it sounds like a good idea. I just don't know how beneficial it actually is.
Fair enough.
Go ahead, Karthik.
Yeah, hi. I think it's a good idea, but I would like to see what the plans are. For example, can I just sign up for my neighborhood and get text messages of what's happening, like what TC said? We would like to know what's happening in and around us. So is that the plan, or it depends on implementation, I guess. I would be more interested in knowing how we are thinking of implementing this. If it's just going to be a website that people have to type in and go look at it, I think that's really old style and people don't really bother to do that. So yeah, I'll stop with that.
Yeah, I mean, we were thinking something where you sign up and then there's either an email or a text that comes to you. You don't necessarily have to go to the website to access the information, but it could be, the way that you sign up to receive communications. I think until or unless there's some sort of standardized system, if the city did want to develop something in that regard, maybe there's some associated guidance or examples that we could develop for people. I mean, it could be as simple as a group text. It could be a group email list. You could have a very simple website and someone could go put their email address in like they do, I think, on the city's website, say, I'm interested in this, and then you get notices anytime anything's happened. So I think it's supposed to be, not a lot of work. It doesn't require you to have to go and access the information, but the information is sent directly to you. So you just would have to opt in to being able to do that.
So we actually started down the path of developing a platform, and it's still actually functional. And we have been working on upgrading our permit tracking system in the background, which has taken quite a bit of time because of some non-compatible systems that we've had to make compatible, which is a big challenge. And the idea that we have is what Jeff outlined, is that you would be able to go to a map or you'd be able to sign up for a notification, and you'd be able to create areas in the city with a radius. You could put a pin on the map, and you could pull a circle out to a certain radius, however big you wanted it to be. So you could put a pin on your house, and you could say 2,000 feet. There'd be a radius around your house, and anytime there was a permit that came in the door within that area, it would send you a text message to your phone with a link to the files that came in for that permit application. That's where we want to be. We're quite a bit from that right now. Several steps to get there, and additional budget requirements to get there. However, not everyone it really gets information that way, and we've realized as a city that we need to deliver information in any way possible to make sure people are informed, and that's our goal. So what we would do is, in addition to that effort, we also would be requiring, if you want us to here, that, as Jeff described, we put up a small sign in front of a site where there's a new home being built. And there'd be a threshold, of course. If someone's doing a new deck or something, we wouldn't require a sign, or something smaller. No, it'd be something of significance, which would be defined. And we also would use our social media staff to help us push this out. We would use our website to have a place you could go on the website to look for it. But one of the things that's a major barrier for our doing business is putting stuff in the Seattle Times legal section. And I'm not trying to say anything negative about Seattle Times. They have a very rigid schedule that you have to meet in order to put ads in the Seattle Times, and what it does is it takes away from our ability to be nimble and our ability to quickly correct things that might be problematic, because we're not in control of it. We need 5 days of lead time to get something in, so you have to give them the text that you're going to put in 5 days in advance of it actually appearing in the newspaper. So it just adds time onto everything, and everyone always complains things take too long. So we would like to stop putting stuff in the Seattle Times and instead use those methods. I mean, I'm not familiar with too many people who actually sit in their home on Sunday and read the legals. If you do, good on you, but I don't have time in my life for that, nor do I suspect most Sammamish citizens with families have time for that. So that's my comment on that.
So, quick question.
I have a clarifying question about the notifications. I agree with what's being said about the, online, but isn't there in the rewrite, it says mailed notice for proposal should be sent by department within 14 days by first class mail to owners of record property within 1,000 feet. So doesn't that take care of, the people that are not monitoring social media, haven't gone to the website? If they're nearby, they're going to receive a first class mailed notification of this significant change or project?
They would, except I think right now for single family homes that doesn't happen. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, that's correct. So the other issue is that even those people that receive mail, we regularly get complaints from people that say they didn't get the item in the mail. And I know myself in my own community, I've called City Hall here in the city I live in and said, hey, why didn't you tell me there was a subdivision going in down there? And they look it up, and sure enough, my name was on their mailing list and my address was on their mailing list. And I go look in my recycle bin, and there's a piece of paper that I got from the city that just had the city logo on it that either I or my kids or my wife put in the recycle, right? So it's not a perfect system, and I'm not faulting people for not getting these or opening them. That does happen. So what we're trying to do again is our goal is to get information to people in every and any way possible to make sure they're aware of what is going on in their community in a way that suits their needs at whatever time of day it is and whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That's how there's multiple ways that communications are occurring in order to take care of that people catch things differently. So, yeah, so I was comfortable with the approaches to the notice, and recognize that there's some development that's needed for the online notification system. which would be beneficial once it goes in.
Can we put something in to expand the geography for noticing based on the scale of the project? So larger projects that have a more meaningful impact on more residents makes more people aware?
You could do that by permit type. You could say that type 1 just requires a sign. Maybe there is no mailing, or maybe it's only a mailing to the immediate surrounding touching properties, right, that are adjacent. Or maybe it's 500 feet. And then you could say for a type 2, there's a sign and a mailing. And then for a type 3, there's a sign and a mailing to a much bigger radius, right? A type 3 requires a hearing. That's what I'm getting to, is that it's of a greater significance in scale and intensity and scope typically. So you might want to make sure more people are aware of it.
And how much of this communication is done at cost to the permit holder compared to the city?
All of it. It's a pass through for us, and we've gotten pretty good at billing back to it. We used to actually stuff envelopes ourselves and take care of all that ourselves. And when I came on board to the city, I had come from a city that had that all automated, and we pretty quickly made the jump to that. There used to be times when we'd have a mailing and we'd have 10 staff stuffing 1,000 envelopes, and it takes a while. When you're hand folding them and hand stuffing them, it takes a while. So we now do it with a vendor. So we just send them a spreadsheet and a PDF of the thing to print, and they take care of everything for us. So it's far more efficient than it used to be. So I'm not afraid of bigger mailings. In the past, we used to cringe when we'd have a large mailing, because that meant that half of our staff were going to be stuffing envelopes for half the day, and I don't know that that's the best use of our time.
And so ideally with that notice and with the sign, there would be information for people to opt into the regular communications. And, until we get to something like David described, which would be amazing, maybe there's a communication plan that has to be submitted with the construction management plan or with the application or something that could, spell out, how they're specifically going to communicate regularly with the neighbors. And, the city, I think ideally should be CC'd on those. So maybe there's a repository for the city to receive those as well, whether it's a specific email address or something else.
So in reading a 9B5, information on how to receive regular updates, we list email, website, and other items. Do those fall under? My concern with the website is it's not pushed to people. So people that's not really signing up for an update, is if someone decides to just have a website and they update things every once in a while. The other aspect is there's no public record being created. There's no retention policy in place. And I think that might be a public record. So I have concerns about somebody updating it and then changing it, and then there was no snapshot of what might have been there at a certain period of time.
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking of the website again as a vehicle to push out information. So we create a lot of websites for projects. We're working on the plan for downtown Spokane right now as an example, just because it's something we're working on right now. And we actually use that for people to be able to sign up. So you can go in, put your email address in, and then anytime we do something in an update, you get like an email that sort of looks like a newsletter, is formatted like the website. So if the website is used as a way, again, just as a way for people to opt in, I think it would work well, and maybe we specify that. I agree with you. If it's just a website and it's not kicking out information, then that would work correctly. But sites like platforms like Squarespace, which we use a lot, or Wix, I mean, you could literally have this set up in 10 minutes, where someone could just put their email address in. You could even have a comment form if they wanted to send in comments or an email that was associated with the site. And essentially all you'd have to do is go in and update that section on the website, and it would get pushed out to everyone. In addition, it would be available for people, maybe they're not direct abutters, but they're interested and they want to go check out the site, it would be there as well. And then there could be a way, again, to push that information to the city as well.
So I think the biggest policy question here for the commission is it okay for us to abandon putting things in the Seattle Times legal ads section, first of all? And secondly, is it appropriate for us to forge ahead with adding some language regarding website use, the social media use, and we'll fine tune that. And we could make it both where somebody goes to it and looks it up, or where they could opt in for future information or delivery of notifications, right? I think a good example of a website use is our town center projects that we have under review. And if you went to the city's website and looked those up, you can submit comment through a jot form. You can register to receive updates on the website and on the project. There's information. There is generational information on the project that is we're not just replacing old information and putting up new information. You can see over time what's happened and what's been pushed out. So that's the idea, is that we would maintain some variation of that level of detail for different projects of different intensities and scope on the website, and we would then find ways to get people to the website and link up to that. We have a pretty grand vision. It's going to take us a while to get there, but there are some interim steps that we could put in motion prior to getting to our ultimate goal.
So Jeff, and then David, along with the policy question, have other cities made this kind of switch from the official city newspaper? Because the word says, official city newspaper, and I'm wondering what is the definition of a official city newspaper?
So we would just be eliminating the newspaper component altogether. My sense is, in my time in Bellevue, we did that quite a while ago. We still put an ad in the legals in the Seattle Times to meet the minimum requirement every day. But what we did was we put an ad in there and said, hey, if you wanted to learn about development projects in the city, go to this website. And we put a link to the website in there. So we weren't constantly chasing down changes to project descriptions or an error or something. And that to us is one of our biggest liabilities, is that an ad gets put in the Seattle Times. We can't retract it. We have 5 days till it goes live, and all kinds of stuff happens in 5 days. So for us to be in ultimate control and have the ability to update to the last minute that information is really important.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if and maybe if you've already talked to legal about this, because I know there are lots of, especially legal notices that still need to go on like a newspaper kind of medium instead of just the website. And, to what Josh said, if there are changes, sure, we might get a notification, but some people might not. And I'm wondering if legal might have a view on this. And my personal preference would be to keep both and kind of follow what, you potentially did in Bellevue, is that saying, hey, go to this website, but at least we have it noticed in a physical, newspaper kind of setting. So I would like to know if you've already talked to legal and what is their take on this.
We talked to legal about it, and it's really, it depends on what the purpose is. So if it's to announce a public hearing, they had more concern about it needing to be in the Seattle Times as a legal ad. But if it's to announce a notice of application, that it's not something that is like a legal notification going out. And I find that over time, and I've been doing this for long, as I'm dating myself here in age-wise. I've been doing this long enough that we didn't have those website options when I first started doing this. Everything had to go to the Seattle Times, and there was a purpose for why it went in the Seattle Times or the local newspaper, right? But I would challenge any one of you to find somebody who's actually reading those legal ads anymore. Because the information is found on social media and websites, and that's where people go. So, we're just trying to modernize. And I appreciate the comment regarding that, because maybe there's that interim step before we finally phase it out, right? For those people that might still be reading those out there,
The other thing too is if we increase or lower the threshold, right, and say every type 1 permit, we'd have exponentially more notices to put in the paper. My favorite one, even beyond the newspaper, with my first job, is you had to go and put it on the bulletin board out in the lobby. So newspaper is a little better than that.
Did you have to chip it in a stone tablet that was on that bulletin board?
No, I'm not quite that old, but I did have to, thumbtack it up there, and I'm thinking, who's going to come look at this?
Yeah.
So, anyways.
Okay, anyone else? I would encourage that we probably wrap this one up and move on to the next one here pretty quick.
Okay. Next one, 17, and this also includes 18. So this is with landscaping. Landscaping and maintenance of plantings can interfere with utilities. And this has come up in our discussions with the Water and Sewer District. And we want to address this partially in the new neighborhood design section, which we're going to be workshopping with you on April 1st. And this can happen in a couple different ways. One, if you can locate a utility corridor that doesn't require you to take out a bunch of trees and then require landscaping, or in this case, not putting landscaping in and just leaving it as a mowed corridor, which isn't as good for the environment as if it could be left in its natural state. So we would like to, again, avoid the issue, and if it can't be avoided, find some way to allow some, native plantings or something. So again, it isn't just mowed grass that happens in those corridors. So question, should there be design criteria and requirements for native plants and utility corridors to avoid conflicts as opposed to limiting utility corridors to mowed grass? We also, in this, I think 18 just deals with the landscaping requirements in general. So we pulled that section in. And we've talked about, there really isn't a planting list. Some codes will have a very specific planting list. The other option is to reference planting lists. And the Washington Native Plant Society has a great resource. It actually has a map. You can locate where you are, and it'll give you a custom list of native plants. And there was a question we got from Commissioner Bresco about the cost of native plants and whether that was more than non-native plants. My experience is that they can actually often be cheaper because organizations like the Washington Native Plant Society will hold like annual or semi-annual plant sales. They'll actually produce or grow the plants to a certain level and then sell them, at a pretty minimal cost. So if you're able to take advantage of that, and we have done that on some of our public works projects with the cities that I've worked for. So we will try to look for it in a little more detail to see if there's any evidence of that. But I was spending some time looking on the Washington Native Plant website before, and do see that there are some upcoming sales and our references to the affordability of that. So I will pause there. And
can I add on to that, Jeff? So one of the challenges we have with utility corridors or utility areas is that the easements that the utility purveyor, in this case, Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer is a common one, stipulate that you can't plant vegetation or materials that will potentially interfere with the underground utilities. So what we're looking at is, people tend to just, sod it or put down some seed or something, or just let it, fill in with weeds. And what we're asking is that someone comes in and puts together a planting plan for native shrub vegetation. We're not looking for trees because that would be in conflict with the utility district. So, but we do want to see some level of 2 to 5 meters of shrubs mixed with some ground cover shrubs, to fill it in. And that's really important for us. I think this is something we heard about in the community advisory group quite a bit. So the question, I guess, is do we want to start? We have not historically, as a city, required landscaping for single-family residential projects. And the question here is, do we want to start doing that? And if so, this would be the first step there, which would be that. And we have some others that'll be coming your way that are along the same lines of frontage landscaping for arterials, that kind of stuff. So I think the fundamental question is, we as a city have not required a certain type of landscaping for single family projects. Do we want to change that going forward and start to require some type of landscaping?
David, can you clarify what you mean by that? And I only say that because when I read the language here, it doesn't quite seem to jive with what you were describing. So do you mean somebody builds one house on one lot and now we have landscaping requirements for that? Or do you mean that when there's a residential development that includes a utility corridor, that there's now landscaping requirements for that utility corridor?
It could be either one of those. You could choose to start it at the level of a long plat, a certain number of units that in this type of project, if you're establishing a utility tract or you're putting in a utility easement, that you are then required to put in some type of landscaping, in this case, native plants. Or it could be with a new single family home. We've seen many cases where when you're putting in a new single family home on a vacant lot and you're bringing in the water or sewer, the water and sewer district requires that you extend the service to the maximum of the property, which means you don't necessarily just have to bring it to the front of your property. You have to actually bring it to the back side of your property. And then you're required to also provide an easement across your property. And when that happens, then you're not able to plant trees on top of that, because the easement that you have that you've given to the water and sewer district says you can't plant trees there. So people end up not planting anything there, and it becomes this sort of mowed strip that is left there. And what we're asking is, do you want to change this pattern that we're seeing and start to require some shrubs be put in there, and native shrubs particularly?
Anyone with comments or questions about that?
Is there
Yeah,
consent?
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I think that it should be a requirement. I think that, if it's left on its own, it's just going to turn into a weed patch. But I think there should be quite a bit of guidance on what you can put in there. I mean, trees, no, we know that, but, shrubs can be just as, have just as many roots as trees do. So, are there certain shrubs that would be better than others, or that are natives, of course? And maybe just have a list. You can put these in there, but you got to do something.
My question was, are we just focusing on the utilities at this time for this design criteria, or will it be also for stormwater ponds? Because that's also another area where we've seen people just kind of put grass, and I know many of our volunteers have gone in and put native plants in there and created a new ecosystem. So what's the long-term plan?
We will address stormwater ponds somewhat in the arterial frontage standards, because that's one of the potential frontage types. I know we discussed last time there may not be a lot of those that happen in the future, but right now there are. So we will address it from that standpoint, and then we could potentially carry that over to all stormwater ponds. And maybe is something we could talk about at our workshop on April 1st. But I believe the city also made some pretty significant changes to those in recent years. Is that correct, David? The ponds have gotten a lot bigger because of the criteria?
Yeah, so we are not seeing as many ponds be built, and if we are, they're really large. And one of the issues is that it takes up so much space, and most subdivision applicants and designers are wanting to double use the space. So if you put the water underground in a vault, you can put a rec space on top of it, so you can double up the use of that space. So vaults have become more appealing in that way. Vaults are expensive, but ponds are expensive in the amount of land they take. You can get exponentially more water in a vault because of its geometric shape than you can in a pond that requires that you grade back the slope, 2 to 1. So for them, it's a mathematical equation around how much water they can fit in it, and secondly, that how much they can use it for as a double purpose, so that they don't have to use other land for that rec space purpose.
Thank you. And are we requiring this particular criteria only when trees are removed from a utility corridor, or is it and then the other thing I'm trying to understand is, so for example, if there's a subdivision and there's a sidewalk and there's a big utility pole, for example, is that also considered as part of the utility corridor, or is it just like those big power lines that I see?
So I think it would be any utility corridor where there's a utility easement, or any tract where it's a utility tract, and that could be I'm back. Can you hear me now? Sorry, I don't know what happened. So it would be any large utility, like the Bonneville type utility. For example, the Costilla or Windsor Estates subdivision out by Beaver Lake. If you went and looked at that one, you might see what I'm talking about. It could be any utility easement that's put in place that provide for a water or sewer connection or extension. It could be a utility tract, which could include possibly, and Jeff probably has some ideas on this, could include a retention detention pond. So maybe we add that in the mix by definition, and that whole pond issue is addressed that way.
Thank you, David.
Do we have a conceptualization as to what this would mean for maintenance to the city? Would there be any additional cost?
Well, I know that developers
So
really
one way versus
like
the next.
I know developers really like this, but we would say it's subject to the homeowners association maintaining it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would point out though that when you consider that mowing, if that does get mowed, is not necessarily a cheap way to maintain something versus shrubs that can kind of grow on their own. So it's maybe not a huge issue, and it improves the environment a little bit for the people that are there.
Yep.
On the policy question, I'm okay with the native plant requirement for utility corridors. I have a little heartburn over 350705, where it's requiring exclusively native plants in what appears to be all landscape areas. That would be an area where I'd want to understand a little bit more what that means. So
I think the idea there is that when you're required to do landscaping, that you're putting in native plants, and the idea there is that I've heard this argued many different angles, but there are many out in the community that have done a lot of research that have found that native plants are completely viable for the use when landscaping is required. It could be used in commercial settings. It could be used in residential settings. And it typically requires less irrigation, less maintenance. It provides additional habitat features, a food source, a forage source. It provides better access for insects that are insects that are desirable, those sorts of things. And that's generally what I've heard. I'm not an expert on any of that. So I would defer to some of the members of our community advisory group who were very voiceful about this, and Jeff, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there's another level down that's, and I'd have to go back and find the language, but I feel like on another project, it might have been for Bainbridge Island, we had something that allowed, we had some criteria for the types of non-native plants that you could use. So maybe it didn't quite qualify as native, but it was still drought tolerant. It wasn't certainly invasive, and it was determined to be appropriate. So we could do a little bit of research on that, but again, I feel like the resources on native plants, both in the availability to get them, as well as resources from different organizations in the state, are certainly making it easier to do so. So I think there is a little bit of potential flexibility there. You could also have this apply only to landscaping that's required. If people want to have additional landscaping, maybe there are some allowances for that. You could have some less stringent requirements for single family homes versus commercial sites. So I think there's definitely a little bit of flexibility that could be built in.
I want to understand who this would apply to. Because I have no issue with encouraging native plants. I don't completely understand all of the benefits of it, but it's the use exclusively native plants. And so I'm wondering who that limits that to. I might end up being completely fine with it. I just don't know who this is being.
Yeah. So, right. So yeah, really good question. So, I mean, I think the short answer is, that's the discussion and we can determine that. But I think right now, I mean, as David said, and this is pretty typical, most cities don't regulate landscaping for single family homes. So my interpretation is that wouldn't apply, that this would apply to landscaping that's required or regulated under the code. But we could craft this, however we see fit. But again, tends to not be a lot of requirements for landscaping on single family homes in most cities. But if we come up with a few things that we think are important, whether it's, the frontage of the property or within a certain feet of the right of way, and we want to have some standards around that, then, something like this, however it's crafted, would apply to those situations. And it certainly would apply the way it's written now, to any commercial sites, all of the different landscaping types that are mentioned in here would apply. There's also an emphasis too, I think, on preserving native plants, right? So if you're choosing to say have a buffer, you're doing a subdivision and you have an arterial on one side, and you're required to have some sort of buffer. If that's a forested area, the first thing would be, let's keep what's there now, right? Like, so you don't have to replant it. If it isn't that and it does need to be restored, then, restoring with native plants and native trees, I think for all the benefits that David described, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so on the policy side, I guess my concern would be is if we were starting to step into someone's property line and start mandating a list of approved plants.
Yep.
That's my only concern.
Understood. And I think that's a good concern.
Anybody else? Jeff, are we going to do 18 now separately?
Yeah, let me see where 18 is here. Well, I have 18 in the code. Let me just see what 18 is. All right, one sec.
You kind of grouped 17 and 18 together, but I think there might be some level of difference.
Yeah, I was just looking for the topic for, oh, there it is. Yeah, this is another good one. Well, not a good one because it's a problem, but a good one for us to discuss. So 18, maintenance of landscaping in the right of way can be a burden to the city. And so let me just go through the examples. Private property owners, including homeowners associations, are responsible for maintaining landscaping in the right of way or in common areas. but it's often neglected and the city is requested to maintain landscaping. This also becomes a code enforcement issue. Well, I should say becomes a city issue, but it really is not a code enforcement issue, or it shouldn't be looked at that way. But it is an issue that the city has to address. So again, to the second bullet, Department of Community Development is often requested to address the lack of maintenance as a code enforcement issue, but it's really the responsibility of Public Works to deal with it as a, as a city-owned right-of-way, and, work with the homeowners to make sure that it's maintained. Landscaping areas are often not native or drought tolerant plants that require more effort and resources to maintain, whether that's, water, irrigation, and things like that. So the policy questions are, should there be new landscaping requirements that require the use of native and drought tolerant plants? We discussed that already, and it sounds like there's pretty broad agreement, but definitely some concern around the requirements, particularly for single family property owners. Are there circumstances where the city may want to take over maintenance of landscaping in the right of way or in open space tracts? If there's a public benefit, or maybe it's taking it over, it becomes publicly accessible, or maybe it's related to some it's a stream buffer or something that's important environmentally, where the city might want to take it over or work with another organization that does environmental restoration. And then should the city Public Works Department provide educational resources and technical assistance to HOAs to maintain landscaping? And I think, part of this too could be, thinking about it at the design level. What are you putting in? How much maintenance does it require? And sort of trying to head off situations that become untenable because it was planted so extensively. And I see this all the time. I mean, even even publicly owned properties, a really nice library, let's say in Seattle, and it's brand new and it looks great, and a couple years later it's just all weeds. So I think really thinking about the maintenance liability up front when you can is important, but for some of these situations, they're already in place, and they've been challenges both for the HOAs if they're not functioning or don't have appropriate funding sources. It becomes a real challenge for the city because they obviously did not have the resources to be able to take that on. I'll stop there for discussion.
So would this apply only for new developments and newer landscaping, or would this be retroactive as well to existing right-of-ways?
Yeah, the issue around maintenance is primarily existing. Going forward, it will also be an issue, but again, you have more opportunity to design it in a way that maybe requires less maintenance. You have a chance to potentially mitigate it, but the immediate issue is there's just a lot of, from my understanding, is there's a lot of right-of-ways and/or common open space that's just not being adequately maintained. And this relates to another issue we're going to talk about on April 1st, which is what is the value and function of this open space that's being provided by developers above what's required, right? On the one hand, hey, it's great, we're getting more open space, but even natural open space can be a liability. If there's hazardous trees or invasive species or unapproved uses that are happening in violation of laws and things like that. So, I think there's sort of the global forward-looking planning issues, but there's also the immediate issues of those properties and sites that are already developed where there's issues with landscaping.
The question I have would be, landscaping includes tree maintenance and stuff like that, or is it just shrubs and, lawn mowing?
It would include everything, street trees, I think. Forested areas theoretically wouldn't require, it's maybe not maintenance, but it's forest management or something. But yeah, I would include it all kind of under this umbrella because I think it touches on kind of the same issue.
Would there be a way to incentivize HOAs to maintain these areas? Like some sort of a tax credit or something like that?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. We've talked about that, and in the section that deals with maintenance of critical areas, or in cases where they're doing invasive species removal, sometimes those can trigger actual permit requirement to be able to do that work. And we've talked about giving the department the ability to waive the fee where it's evident that the permit fee is an obstacle to that work happening. David has some good examples where HOAs have not moved forward with maintenance responsibilities because of those permit fees. So we are thinking about it in that sense, but a lot of this we're talking about specifically here doesn't require a permit. Certainly could think about some other incentives. We've thought about things like educational resources and things like that. We've seen in some communities, there's community groups that get really interested in landscaping and they want to volunteer and turn it into a community event. That's something we could do. Maybe the city could facilitate providing plants. Maybe in some cases, the landscaping is just too complicated. And so maybe the city could, help facilitate, some redesign of that in a way that's, less maintenance. So I think it's something we can think about. I'm not sure I have the perfect solution on that quite yet.
So one of the issues is that in the past, the city has, in the county largely, has authorized subdivisions that require dedication and establishment of landscaping in the right-of-way. And then they have gone ahead and put on the face of that final plat document and required it on the homeowners association through some of the CCRs and things that get recorded that the landscaping that is established as part of the project in the city's right-of-way or the county's right-of-way back then is then therefore to be maintained in perpetuity by the HOA from the division that created the landscaping. So the issue here is that the developer was required to dedicate the right-of-way, build out the road, and then was required to put in landscaping, and then the developer was required to put in the community covenants and restrictions, the fact that the HOA would be, and it's on the face of the plat, that the HOA would be maintaining that landscaping that it was established in the right-of-way. So the landscaping is not even on a tract that's owned by the HOA. It's actually in the city's right-of-way, but it says in their CCRs and on their their plat document that they are required and obligated to maintain it. So what ends up happening is HOAs not wanting to pay dues and whatnot. I get it. Why would you want to pay for something that you don't have to? End up not choosing not to maintain it, and then the city has to then go after them and remind them that that is their obligation. They then ask, well, why isn't the city doing it? It's in the city's right of way, and we have to then remind them that it's part of when the HOA goes. They no longer have an HOA. Who do you go after? Who maintains it? So this wouldn't necessarily solve the problem of the past, but this would help us straighten. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know where I cut out. I noticed that it went out on me, so I apologize. But what I was getting at is this helps straighten out going forward. It doesn't fix the past. We can't unwind all those plats and change them, but it does fix any new projects that come in. It helps clarify that we firmly believe that if they were to use better designed landscaping, it would be far less maintenance required. So native plants, better design, better outreach materials. That maybe there's some sort of a kiosk in the neighborhood that talks about landscaping and why it's important, and that their HOA is responsible for maintaining it. Just to make sure everyone's aware of it. That's all.
Mike? Maybe it's a bit related, but I'm looking at the box that says preferred solutions. Grant the city ability to take over landscape areas and, where there's demonstrated public benefit. So, David, I assume that some of what you're describing relates to that example you just gave. I'm particularly interested here in how we would demonstrate the public benefit to warrant then that, sort of taking of the land, so to speak.
So Jeff laid out one where it's easy to demonstrate public benefit, and that is with regard to riparian area. And if there is a section of landscaping that's in a riparian area that has become overtaken by a colonizing noxious weed, it's pretty easy for us to show there's a public benefit to aquatic habitat in going in and clearing out that blackberry and restoring the to a native landscape. That's an example. Generally speaking, the city doesn't have the budget to take over private projects that in maintenance of even its own landscape, even its own right of way. We don't have the budget to take over the linear footage of maintenance of our right of way that is otherwise the obligation of an HOA. And that would be a big cost burden on the city to do that. Other things that could be done that maybe we could allude to in code is that the city might help coordinate a bundled effort so that each HOA isn't purchasing their own contract with a landscaper, that maybe we negotiate a master contract and that they then are able to purchase services, although we pay prevailing wage and they probably don't have to. So, there's a difference there too, right? There's a whole lot of different things to consider here.
Another one would be safety. If landscaping's not maintained, say in the right of way on a corner and it's blocking the site visibility, that may be one where they come in and, the city removes some landscaping or does something to make it so that that's not, an ongoing issue. Another one might be there's an open space track. It's not being properly managed. Maybe there's a public benefit because the city wants to make a trail connection or have a small park or something. I mean, those are probably more minor, opportunities, but those could be other options. Or if there's a utility need for some sort of utility extension or something like that, could be something even unrelated to the landscaping. So those are just a couple of examples potentially.
I have a question on cost. What do we think that this is going to cost if city has to take over maintenance and so on? Is there any estimate?
It's a very large cost. I couldn't pin it down. You need to look at and think about the linear footage and how much it costs. If you had say a 5-foot wide swath, how many linear feet you're looking at for maintenance in the right of way, even 10 feet, 20 feet wide for that, then you need to multiply that out for the amount that we're taking over. But the issue here is I think that the city is not currently in a position where we are wanting to take over the maintenance of these areas. What we rather are looking for is that the HOAs are more timely in their actual fulfillment of their obligation that's written into their final plats, and that they actually complete that maintenance on more of a schedule. And I don't know the answer here. This is a complicated one for us because some HOAs do a great job, some HOAs not so much.
Mm-hmm.
If the city has to go in and maintain it for them, can they bill the HOA? I mean, there's of course the issue of will they pay, but is there anything like that that's ever looked at or done?
Not at this point. That could be a solution here. I think that's more of a punitive solution, although it is their obligation. So one thing you could do is a partner amendment to the section that requires that. I can't remember what, I can't see, I can't see close enough. But what we would do there, and then we'd have another partner amendment in Title 23, which is the code enforcement section, which would then enable us to fee them for that service.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a long-term solution because, again, I don't think the city has the resources nor wants to get into that. But I'm just thinking in an emergency situation, or particularly, let's just say you have a huge, large, area, and it's, you know, particularly being a nuisance and the city does something to rectify it, at least it wouldn't have to be at their own cost. It's more as a fail-safe.
Karen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think minimally what we want to do is, you know, have the low maintenance plant material. So have, you know, maybe have a landscaper come up with 3, 4, or 5 different plans for the right-of-way strip that, you know, you guys can choose from these. These are all really low maintenance. And then when our forestry plan comes into effect, there's going to be all this mulch, right? So maybe that free mulch gets delivered to the neighborhood and somehow they're responsible for spreading the mulch to keep the weeds down. So you've got your basic landscaping and then you've got a plan for the maintenance of the keeping the weeds down. Something along those lines.
Yeah, I agree.
But minimally, I think we have to, you know, the drought tolerant native. And then in bigger areas, the same thing, you know, there, I don't know the cross street, but pretty close to the city hall there on 228th and one of the cross streets, there's a corner where it's all like alders and it's all filled in with those alders and it looks really nice. I mean, it's not very useful. You can't really walk through it, but you know, at least it looks nice.
Okay, can we move on to the next one?
Yes, we can. This one is, I alluded to this in the last one. So this is number 28. Permits are required for regular maintenance of landscaping and/or infrastructure in critical areas. Now this is a little bit of a different issue, but right now there is a requirement that even regular maintenance of ditches, culverts, drainage features, shoulders and paths, lawn and landscape maintenance, if it's in critical areas or a buffer, including invasive species, invasive plant and weed removal requires a permit. So even the city activities that they're having to do requires them to get a permit. And you know, there isn't, I think, a lot of benefit in doing that because, again, it's already a developed area. It's within a right-of-way, say, or within a utility area. So the policy question is, should there be permanent exemptions for maintenance and infrastructure that is part of an approved development and does not expand the development impact with respect to critical areas and buffers? So I'll pause there. Questions, comments?
I'd say that one seems relatively straightforward as long as there's some limits so that there wouldn't be an opportunity for somebody to take advantage of what maintenance means and start doing more than what they should. But otherwise, that seems pretty straightforward one.
I would say yes to the question.
Yeah, I think we agree. We think it's fairly straightforward, and there is a lot of allowances that are similar, like in you know, shoreline rules and SEPA rules. You know, often again deal with a developed corridor or whatnot differently than something that's new. Okay, move on. All right. 32, revise or refine the technically feasible deviations that were added during phase 1. This is in the clearing, I believe it's clearing and grading. Problem, examples, and narratives. Small lots lead to more impacts from clearing and grading by providing less flexibility in site design is something we'll probably talk about in the workshop, but this notion that in some cases, maybe the small lots are contributing to more grading requirements. The technically feasible deviations were added to the code as part of phase 1 and would be better communicated with the addition of graphics. So allowing, and then the last one, allowing excavation beyond 10 feet for only the building should be considered. So that's not an example, but that's a narrative. So maybe I could just you're all probably very familiar with this from phase one, but essentially I believe, and David, please correct me, but these limits on grading were put in place in phase one. So excavation shall not exceed 10 feet, fill shall not exceed 5 feet. And then there were some deviations where you could, under certain circumstances, exceed the 10 or the 5. And I think in some cases they're maybe a little bit confusing and could be clarified. So that right now the code says instances where driveway access would exceed 15% slope if additional fill is not permitted, where the 5-foot fill maximum is observed but limited additional fill is necessary to accommodate localized undulations or variations in existing topography. Where necessary to achieve a balance of excavation and fill, where a building foundation access, grade, drainage, or other necessary components of a proposed structure or infrastructure is deemed infeasible. And then there's some further limits down there. One thing that we thought of and is proposed here in the red is that maybe there's a way to separate different types of excavations. And if the excavation is simply around the building, meaning the cut is not like expanding the building footprint so there's a flat area around it, it's just for the building, that really more cut should be allowed because again, the building is sort of operating as a retaining wall in that sense and is sort of creating a better building design that's a little bit more integrated with the hillside. So the questions for the Planning Commission: should the city allow for more cut if it is only the building and does not result in additional cuts around the building to create usable open space? David has a great photo, I believe he sent me, of an example where it may not even have been in accordance with the permit, but I think it may even have been after the fact. They started cutting around the building to create it, and it's just really stark, and I think against what the city's looking for. Should the city have requirements for larger lot sizes where they will allow for more limited clearing and grading? And I'm thinking, driveways might be one where there's a bigger lot. You can sort of have, more room to maneuver without necessarily having to do more cutting or filling in those situations. And then one last point is I think we could look at trying to create some graphics as well. This is related to the building height issue. We're going to be proposing some modifications to how height is calculated based on what we're going to call modules. So it's like certain pieces of the building so that the buildings kind of tend to step up or down the hill and you don't get these sort of larger massive buildings with really tall walls on one side. David, anything you want to add, please?
Yeah, you read my mind. If I could add on to that, so thank you, Jeff. Well described. One of the big issues that we have faced historically is that we went from a community that was originally established where the homes, the lot lines were draped over the existing topography, and the homes were built into the existing topography back in the early developments up on the plateau, to more recent developments where the builder goes in and strips the land and terraces it out, puts in walls and those sorts of things, and creates a flat pad for building, and does quite a bit of manipulation of the topography. I think the policy question with phase one that we were confronted with is, do we want to stop that policy, and do we want to stop that type of construction, and do we want to revert back to the older style of construction that you see in some neighborhoods where it's more sensitive to the existing topography? And the answer to that question in phase one was yes. So I think the question here is what can we do to help promote the better outcomes that we're looking for, where we're accepting things like cuts that are made for foundations of homes, where the foundation serves as a retaining wall and it allows you to key in a daylight basement into a hill, but you're not regrading the whole site and flattening it out. Another one is where do we allow that to happen in order to facilitate a driveway so the driveway is not too steep? You've all seen, some of those images on social media of construction fails where the driveway is like a wall and they can't get up the driveway. So we don't want that either. So we're trying to find that balance, and how do we set up requirements in our code that gets the outcomes that we want. We did the heavy lift with phase one. We're trying to fine tune this. So if you have any ideas about things we can do to promote retaining the existing landscape topography, minimizing tree removal and vegetation, trying to discourage large-scale stripping of vegetation and grading of land in favor of strategically putting in roads and strategically building driveway approaches and designing homes so that they fit. Definitely open.
Yeah.
So I would have to admit that I thought, excuse me, I didn't realize that there was a limitation on on excavation for the building to begin with. I thought that the limits we put on grading were outside of the building footprint. So that one seems like relatively straightforward, especially if it's results in the building itself being built into the existing grading, because that's kind of what we wanted to begin with.
Yep.
I have to admit, I had to read this second bullet point under question for Planning Commission a few times to try to understand what the real meaning of that was. So
Yeah, I was just going to speak to that. So one of the things that we've seen in sort of looking at the code and in some of the materials that we're preparing for the April workshop is because the city doesn't have a minimum lot size. What developers are doing in some cases is creating these open space tracts, right? So maybe it's a 30-acre site and 10 acres, they're going to put in an open space tract with trees and whatnot. And so what that allows them to do is to shrink the lot sizes down, which minimizes the length of road that you have to build. And it kind of reduces, I think, in some ways, your construction costs. But now that you have quite small lots and very large homes, that really doesn't allow you, as David said, to kind of fit things in with topography. You end up with more manipulation on that part of the site, and it really also makes it very difficult to preserve any trees on those lots or in any proximity to those lots. So you basically have the developable area that's completely, cleared and graded into flat lots, and you get, very similar large homes on small lots, and then you have a 10-acre, piece of forest next to it. And those aren't really integrated. That's not really, I think, the character of Sammamish that we've heard from the public, but particularly from the community advisory group, where, regardless of where you are in one of the older developments, you really get that sense of the trees and the natural environment and the topography. And what you're getting in the newer developments is really sort of two things. You're getting these protected forested, small forested tracts, and then you're getting these really manipulated sites. So how do we sort of maybe bring those together? And I think the larger lot size, rather than thinking of it as a 10-acre open space tract, maybe those trees and natural elements could be more integrated into the development. And the larger lot sizes might be a way to prevent all of the land being cleared where the home sites are, as well as this, extensive manipulation, which, now can't be the same way it was because there already has been some progress on these limits. But those are the kind of things that we've been kind of thinking about. We want to workshop with you on April 1st.
So for question 2, is the question really, should we have a minimum lot size? And really the second part of the question is just an example of the result of having a larger lot. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, you're reading it right. And I think, the question is, I think the question is not necessarily should you have a minimum lot size. That's one solution to it. I I think there are other ways that you could get there. One of the things we're going to preview with you in April is having a floor to area ratio requirement, which would inevitably scale the size of the lot to the size of the house. And we can set that so again, you could preserve a significant tree or a group of significant trees on a lot, or all lots, and that would give you the ability to do it. So I think the answer is yes, it could be a minimum lot size, but it could be something else too that controls for that. Because right now, you know, in the let's say the R4 district, you know, your quarter acre lot size is going to be about 10,000 square feet. You're only required to provide 390 square feet of open space. And yet in some of those districts, you're getting lots of 5,000 square feet, which I think, and the homes are quite large. And so that really limits your ability to do anything other than create a flat pad and clear all the trees in order to be able to develop that site.
Other comments or questions? No? Okay.
Okay.
Go to the next one.
Okay, we're starting to get down to the easier ones, just as a point of reference. This one's pretty straightforward. So development categories in the
don't jinx us by saying stuff like that.
I'm not, but you're doing so well. Number 25, which we nested with 26, development categories defined in the code are not consistent with those listed in the decision types. So include unified development zone permits, UZDP. Those are permit type in the town center. It's listed as a type 2 in the town center code, which means it's a director decision. There's a desire to make it clear that it's a type 3 decision, which is a director recommendation to the hearing examiner, appealable, you know, to court. And then we want to remove urban plan developments as a type 3 from the code. They don't, that type of application does not exist. It's a remnant from the King County code. So if the fundamental policy question is, should the UZDP applications, which is, you know, tend to be pretty large scale projects in the town center, should that be a type 3 process, which goes to the hearing examiner, subject to you know, a more robust open public process in terms of, you know, having hearings and stuff. And if you go down here to the land use chart, there's a couple of other things around accessory structures, which we talked about last meeting, but simply the change is type 3. You had the unified zone development permits, and then I pulled in just a little bit of town center code just to give you a sense of it, but the code is, you know, there's reference to type 2 applications throughout that code, so we would have to go through and make those changes, but that's more or less what this one is just making the UZDP a type 3 process.
And from the staff perspective, we would highly recommend making that a type 3 process, not just for the city's benefit, but also for the community's benefit. A project of that magnitude, people really want a place to have their voice heard, and a hearing will do that. It also provides the opportunity for an independent audit to occur on the city's recommendation. The hearing examiner works much like an auditor. So when we make a recommendation to the hearing examiner, there's one more set of eyes on that is just double checking the work to make sure that everything adds up.
Yeah.
Anybody have questions about that?
Okay.
Okay.
Number 23, refund provisions and timelines are unclear and do not specify which permit fees are eligible. Preferred solution, the director will maintain a policy on permit refunds and make it accessible to the public. Let's give an example here. Applicants are required to pay a deposit as an initial payment towards the cost of review. The city keeps track of the amount of time spent reviewing applications. If the deposit isn't used, then the applicant is entitled to a refund. However, the refund provisions are not clear, and the city should consider the deposit to potentially be a minimum review fee. We talked about this in our internal staff meetings, but in some cases, the application, the base fee is pretty low compared to other communities that I've worked with. So you could consider just making that a minimum fee regardless, so the city doesn't have to deal with the administrative costs of doing that. But in other situations, there might be potentially a need to refund a part of an application if it's withdrawn or something like that. So it's a simple fix. It's in 2005-040, dealing with application requirements and permit fees, and just says that the director shall maintain that policy and make it available. David, is there anything else you want to add on that one?
No, that's a good explanation. It's something we need to clean up in our code.
Is there there's the minimum base fee, minimum, what about charging the applicant more if you go through 50 rounds with them, for example? Is there anything in there for that in the code for charging them hourly after?
Yep. Yeah, there is, and the cities, keeps track of that. They have a time tracking system that I think David's implemented and is using, and they do bill them. I mean, the other piece of this is the city's going to be undergoing a fee study upcoming, and so they could revise those. And I think one of the things, I think would be good to look at is what is the average cost of a fee, and try to make the minimum more similar, so you don't have to deal with billing people when it's likely that they're going to, require more than the minimum fee. So they'll be able to calibrate that a little bit. But yes, there is a way, and the applicants are required to pay for all those costs. And so, as you said, there's a built-in incentive to submit a good application that doesn't require multiple reviews. And if you do, then you're going to pay more. Any other questions?
Yeah, my one comment about this was just that I actually had a little bit of an experience with this with the city, but I think that, one of the things that we need that the city can do is create particularly for smaller projects and for, homeowners trying to do a project, is create a sense of fairness. So be really clear in the communication. I mean, I think that, the idea of providing a refund if somebody pulls their permit, for somebody who's a smaller, just a resident trying to do something small, that's a pretty, for the amount of money we're probably talking about, that's a pretty powerful message that the city is treating residents in a way that's, fair and respectful. If it's not going to be that way, then it just needs to be really crystal clear when somebody submits their initial fee that it's just an initial fee and it's a minimum and it's not refundable. We could fuss about this a lot, and it may not even add up to all that much money, but the perception part of it could become a big deal for a lot of the smaller projects, and it's probably worthwhile just making sure that we create a sense of the city's doing a good job for the citizens of the community. And this is kind of one way where if you're somebody who got a refund, you feel like, wow, the city of Sammamish is super fair about this kind of stuff. Whereas if you didn't understand that was the case and then you didn't get it, then you wouldn't necessarily perceive that. So from almost like a PR standpoint, I think we should just be a little bit careful about being super, super clear when we undertake this kind of a process.
Yeah, thanks. Good point.
Anybody else?
Okay.
No?
Okay, 22, residential parking requirements sometimes conflict, are sometimes unclear, and can lead to parking that is poorly designed. I think it's cut off a little bit there. And I think it says dominates the street frontage. One of our solutions would be require a parking summary as part of a new subdivision that demonstrates that parking is right sized for the anticipated demand, including both on and off street parking. So streets are not oversized or, I guess, undersized with respect to parking. Give a couple examples. Subdivisions are providing in some cases more parking than is needed when considering the combination of on and off street parking, right? So if you're building, let's say you're in the R4 district and you're building a street with parking on both sides of the street, and you're building a pretty wide street section. Actually, I think it kicks up into R6 that you have to do that. That's a lot of parking. And if that parking is just for the neighborhood and everyone has, the ability to park 4 cars on the street, it's a lot more expense for the developer, which means a lot more expensive for the housing, creates environmental issues, and just frankly is kind of a waste of space. The other situation which has come up is that there may be an addition to a subdivision, and that subdivision doesn't provide enough parking, and then people are parking in the older part of the subdivision and negatively impacting that area. So it's not about saying you need more parking or less parking. Really, it's about right sizing it. And so one of the things we'd like to do is when you're submitting an application for a subdivision, you actually have to provide a summary. How much parking is there, right? And if you're, between the street and the garage and the driveway, you're providing, 8 parking spaces per home, that's probably more than you need. And there's probably better uses for those resources and ways to, minimize the impacts on the environment from all of the runoff. So that's kind of what we're looking for. It's related to the new neighborhood design standards that we'll be talking with you on April 1st. And, we could develop some metrics for, a parking maximum potentially. I mean, we certainly don't want to create parking congestion and issues, but we do have seen some examples of subdivisions in Sammamish, that have pretty narrow streets and still does allow for some intermittent parking. And it seems, to work well. It's also kind of a traffic calming measure as well. So that's the issue. And so the question for the commission is, should the city consider maximum parking for residential subdivisions to reduce impervious surfaces, stormwater runoff, support small scale streets, and reduce costs associated with construction that could be utilized on other portions of the project? And then related to that would be the policy question of adding that parking summary as a submittal requirement. Pause there.
Anybody have questions? How significant of a problem is this? It's many instances.
Well, I mean, from my standpoint, I do, my part of my practice is I do a lot of parking consulting with cities big and small. And so what I think is, if you had an R6 development and you built a residential street with parking on both sides of it, my sense is that's way overkill. And why it's also an issue is that there's never going to be enough parking that's happening on that, so that basically what ends up happening is it appears as though the street is much wider than it's intended to be, and it creates potential speeding and potentially safety issues. So I think it's a big issue from a design perspective. From the residents and people live there, are they feeling really impacted by it? I don't know, but I do think it is a significant issue that at least warrants some discussion. And I think on April 1st we could bring some examples to you and talk through that with you. I know in the neighborhood that I grew up in, we have the same thing, and so. If your 2 travel lanes are 11 feet and you have 8-foot lanes on the side, that's 38 feet. And if no one's parking on those streets, then that's a 38-foot section for a 2-lane road, and can lead to higher traffic speeds and potential safety issues.
If I could add something. So in phase 1, we added a requirement that there be an additional equivalent of 1 on-street parking space be provided per residence in the division. And that was in response to the fact that there was not enough parking being provided, that there was not enough right-of-way being established. And And that's that complaint that Jeff mentioned. We heard regularly of people saying, hey, they'd call us, hey guys, can't believe you approved this project. They had a Super Bowl party and there's 30 people parked on my street, because nobody can park in the new division, right? So that was an issue that we were seeing is old versus new. So we added a minimum requirement. You have to have one per home established. So Jeff's, I think, talking also about a maximum requirement. So we're trying to set the bookends properly. And I think what Jeff's adding here too is really wise. What it's saying is you need to give us a plan that shows how your parking is going to be functional, right? So it's requiring that they do a little better design, a little more forward thinking. They're not setting the driveways, alternating each other. One of the problems we used to see is you'd have the driveways are offset and you can't put parking across from a driveway because someone will back out into the cars. So, and then their mailboxes were offset and there's nowhere for anybody to park. So what we ended up with was scenarios where you had a lot of right of way, a lot of impervious, and not any functional parking. So I think what we're trying to do is push designers to think a little harder and to try and make it all match up and fit.
Yeah.
So really said. Clarifications. Thank you.
Sorry, Mike. I think that the goal here is a good one. My question is, so generally, yes, I think to answer the question directly, yes, I think that's a good idea. My question though is there a more scientific method of determining the appropriate amount of parking stalls per single family home? Or so can we do something that's more like that, where we give some buffer on the plus or minus there, rather than these? I mean, I get the goal, it just seems kind of arbitrary. So if there's some sort of formula, I think that might be something I'd be interested in looking at closer.
Yeah, we'll do some more analysis and come up with that. Again, the 200% was a placeholder. I'm assuming right now the requirement is 2 per household, maybe two on site and 1 in the right of way. And I think we'll probably find some examples. Again, I haven't gone and done the analysis, but in the examples where there's 2 lanes of parking, there's probably, I mean, I don't want to guess, but there's probably a lot more parking than you might expect. It could be 5 or 6 stalls, per unit. So I agree with you. We need to come up with that metric. I don't quite have it dialed in yet, and we'll work on that and come back to you with the proposal.
Anybody else? Nope.
Okay, 21. This is addressed with topic 8, which is the supplemental list of application requirements. So decisions on the development may not further the comprehensive plan. As you know, the Growth Management Act requires comprehensive plan and development regulations to be consistent. So theoretically, the regulation should already reflect the comp plan. Some cities will go to the point of trying to codify a standard that says it has to comply with the comprehensive plan. I think there are some questionable, I think, legal issues around that. And so what we thought would be kind of a good solution is to have an application requirement, which requires the applicant to submit a statement outlining how the project furthers the comprehensive plan. So while it may not necessarily be a reason to deny the project, it gets the applicant thinking about it, as well as allows the city to review their response. So our proposal would be to add it to the list of supplemental application, or add it to the list of application requirements in 2005-040. And the question for the commission is, do you agree with that? Should we add that as a criteria for your submittal of your application?
So Jeff, my one comment about this was really mostly just, it feels different than some of the other items that we're talking about, in that it's much more of a subjective, soft kind of a thing that I like the idea, but it's hard to tie it to a specific purpose. if we set parking requirements and it's whatever, right? Two on-site, one off-site for each individual. Well, you can measure that and you can, deny a permit request or ask for a revision. That's pretty tangible stuff in the code. This is not a bad idea, but it doesn't really have a specific objective. So I don't know, that seems like you water down other parts of the code by putting stuff like this in, even when it's a good idea. I'm not opposed to it, but I think it's kind of it's a little bit odd in the way that it fits into everything else.
So I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is, and I hear what you're saying, Chair Boffman. The real underlying purpose here is to make the comprehensive plan relevant, because oftentimes the comprehensive plan is a forgotten relic that isn't really relevant in development review. Yet at the same time, the purpose of the development rules is to implement the comp plan. So what we're trying to do is to pull the comp plan in to the conversation and hope that with an applicant telling us how it meets the comp plan, number one is it makes them aware that we actually have a comp plan, because we have applicants that don't even recognize that we have one. Number two is that it has them reading the comp plan, and hopefully there's some level of discovery when they're reading it and something they might change in their design as a result of reading it. One could always hope. Not real optimistic about that one, but we could always hope. And that finally, what it does is it allows us to start to look at projects more in terms of what is the city's vision statement, what are our policies that we have, and how are we ultimately getting those results in development regs. And it's helping us better understand that over time, so we can start to put in place better efforts to fine tune our codes. If any of that makes sense, that's really where this one comes from. Other cities do require it as a matter of criteria for subdivision approval, for example. One of the criteria is the proposal is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan. So adding a criteria like that for a subdivision or a type 2 action, type 3 action, type 4 action might be valuable.
Well said.
Should we take a moment?
So I think,
Sorry, should we take a moment to move to extend the meeting?
Somebody want to? I'll take that as a motion. Somebody want a second? Let's pick a time. Let's extend to 9. How about that? Just and then let's try to beat that.
So move to extend the meeting to 9 o'clock.
Second.
All those in favor, move to extend to 9, say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Okay. Thanks for doing that, TC.
So David, I had a quick question on that. I understand and I appreciate the spirit of what we're trying to do here. How do you hold them accountable if they don't follow the spirit? I mean, it could be just that people might put whatever they want to appear. Is there going to be some criteria which says you have to show exactly how you've met the spirit and the vision of the comp plan on each of the sections, or where are we going to draw the line?
So in reality, it's very hard to enforce. It's very hard to say, that you didn't comply. I think there are certain projects we've reviewed where that is a requirement because of where it's located, where it was easier to discern because the comp plan is more specific. I'll let you find those projects. But the issue here is that as long as an applicant is trying to show that what they're doing ultimately is meeting the objectives of our comp plan, that's a major step and a success for us, because it's helping us pull together for the community that we have a vision statement, we have we have goals and policies in our plan, and the developer is meeting them for these reasons. And if somebody wants to argue they're not, well, then we can have that debate, and we will. But I think it also helps build awareness in the community about what those policies actually say. Because I would also throw out there, and I'm not faulting anyone, but that most of our community has not read our comp plan. So, you know, it's helpful to have that conversation and bring it to the surface, because you might be surprised what it actually says.
This is almost more like a process requirement than a criteria. I mean, think of it more like project guidance. Think of it more in line with the things that might start to create a better culture of development, which we've talked about. You know, we've worked with other cities like to create a part of the process that requires a context analysis. So before, you know, this would be like something you might do at project guidance, or after it, you come in, you have to give us a context map, you know, show what the natural features are, how the site connects to its surroundings, where the access is. And that's not something that the city is saying you're approved or you're denied, but it starts to build a level of understanding in the applicant that even though it's not something where we're saying yes or no, it does, I think, lead them towards a better solution where they actually have to think about it and justify it. So again, some cities try to codify it, and we could do that, but I think you sort of run into more issues for all the reasons that you have already described, of trying to sort of verify compliance. But I do think it could be an important sort of process piece to get people thinking about it.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first saw this, I felt like the general guideline of keep things simple, don't provide additional burdens for documentation and so forth, that I would have said no. But I do recognize and really appreciate the ability of requiring this to maybe get a little bit closer to the developers towards having a partnership, that we're working towards, you know, where we want to go in Sammamish. And the other part of it was, I thought, well, wouldn't the code drive you to that? But kind of the code says, you can't do this, you know, as opposed to creating that vision. So I have to say that, you know, David, primarily from what you were saying, Jeff, a little bit about what you're just saying now, I've probably shifted my thinking on that this could be worthwhile. I would hope that it wouldn't be burdensome, you know, that would be kept to a minimum, but at least that there's a kind of check the box that this project that we're embarking on, the development, is consistent with where, you know, Sammamish wants to go from its comprehensive plan. And here's why, and that hopefully would create that greater sense of partnership in terms of, you know, what we're all trying to accomplish. You've changed my mind.
So I agree with Mike on this. My concern is having someone write a narrative. It becomes, I think, really difficult to go. The comprehensive plan is pretty large, and then having to go through and write a report on how the project meets it seems pretty burdensome for both the applicant and then the staff to go through, decipher it, and determine if their language matches up with what was in the comp plan. So I like where we're going with the end result, but I think maybe if we could do like a flow chart, or like a check the box, check the ways in which your plan matches up with the comprehensive plan, and provide, you know, 3 sentences and how it accomplishes that, so that we're guiding them through the comp plan and they're explaining it and it matches up exactly. That might be easier and solve the same thing, but generally I like the direction that this is going, because I think the character aspect is what you get to, like Mike was saying, when you read the comp plan versus the code just sets guardrails.
Yeah, great ideas. And I think, you know, the new section that we're going to be working on for neighborhood design, you know, will I think more overtly express some of the goals of the comp plan, but I thought those were great ideas. We'll give some more thought to how that could be structured.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
I think we've already done this one. 14, it was addressed with 16, had to do with enforcing development standards when projects are complete or near completion, adding fines. For work that's in conflict with approved plans. One thing we didn't talk about, but maybe you saw it on the screen, was we developed some additional reporting requirements for qualified professionals. There was a qualified professional section, but it was pretty narrow. And so we kind of expanded it to include more types of professionals that could be charged with verifying based on their credentials certain aspects of the project being done in accordance with the plan. So kind of creating a little bit of a self-monitoring system. And this is something that, you know, I've seen some bigger cities start to move towards because of the resource challenges for cities is, you know, requiring on qualified and certified professionals to approve some stuff to document some of this. So an applicant violates a permit condition to always maintain access along a private street during construction would be one example. This is the other topic. The city discovers the applicant has violated the permit condition, but does not have the means to enforce the violation or issue a stop work order. Policy questions. What types of qualified professionals should be authorized to verify the project was complete in accordance with the permit and approved plans? And then a question about appropriate amounts of fines, which I think we've discussed previously. So it's primarily this issue around qualified professionals. And if you'd like, I could go back up and list them, but we had like engineers, landscape architects, forget what else we had listed there, stormwater professionals. I mean, we could sort of craft that however we wanted to, but we wanted to just expand it a little bit beyond the narrow list that was in there now. I'll stop there.
Jeff, I would say most everybody you listed there, and I admittedly didn't read that list, but almost everybody you listed there was a licensed professional.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, you know, stormwater kind of depends who it is, but
yeah. Geotech, sorry, was the other one.
Yeah, that's probably licensed as well. So, you know, that seems like that's a pretty good criteria. And it sounds like that's close to what you were listing.
Yeah. Yeah, we want people that have state licenses because they're going to be, you know, they have more on the line, and you know they're certified under the state to do it. So
yeah, they have a professional obligation to act a certain way. So I think that's a good criteria.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Okay. And then that's it. We're back to the issues that we discussed last time. You know, we did provide, I don't believe we had these tables in the last one. So, I mean, if you know, anything caught your eye in reviewing it, you want to discuss it, happy to do so. But we went through all of the list of the topics that we didn't go through last time. So nice job.
Does anybody have any comments about this kind of final list here? Having thought about it since our last meeting? I would say, for you, Jeff, at least, I did make a few written comments on a couple of these, which are worthy of just reading but not going through here in this forum.
Great, will do. We'll compile those comments and create an updated draft that we can provide to you at the appropriate time.
Okay. Anything else for these green, low priority, or whatever we call them, the green topics? Anything we missed or anybody would like to say? Did we wear everybody down?
Shout out to Jeff and Dave for putting this together in this format. It was very easy to follow, and I really like the questions that you already had listed for Planning Commission. So that was a very good, well put together presentation.
Thank you very much.
I'm sensing that you're training us for the harder efforts to come.
We are. You guys passed with flying colors, so
Great.
should be a good meeting next time. So I could just preview just real briefly for the April workshop. We're going to get into the red topics, which we're calling high priority. And we'll be we won't be necessarily going through draft code quite yet. Again, these are the topics we want to get a little more direction from the commission before we start writing code. So it'll be a little bit higher level, deal with some of the fundamental issues, which I think we previewed a little bit tonight, mainly around neighborhood design as well as site design for residential projects. So we'll expect to have the materials to you certainly by next Friday. So you'll have, almost a full week to review those in advance, and are really looking forward to a good discussion at that meeting.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Nice job. David, anything else to say about this topic before we move on?
No, other than thank you for your time and focus on this. I know this is a big lift for the city, and you're doing the foundational work for the next 20 years here. So this is a big deal.
All right, thanks. Normally we would have our public comment here again, though I think we've determined that with the technical challenges that we're not able to have our agenda related public comment for this evening. So I'll just restate that if someone's watching this meeting on the recording, we apologize, we can't do the live public comment, but please come back. We're going to continue to talk about these topics quite a bit, and we really would appreciate any public comments that we can receive about them. So either written or if you can join one of our other meetings. And please, I'd encourage all the commissioners to take a close look at the calendar. That's been a bit of a challenge. We have a pretty detailed calendar with a lot of meetings upcoming, and the times are shifting around a little bit. Many of them start at 5:30 instead of 6:30. So please take a close look at that to make sure we get everything going on time. Okay.
If I could interrupt, Chair Boffman, we are going to post this recorded version of the meeting tomorrow, hopefully as early in the day, as quick as it will download for us. And we are extending the written public comment, or all public comment will be written until 5 p.m. tomorrow. So if you do watch this and would like to submit public comment for this particular meeting, you can email planningcommission@sammamish.us for your written comments. And we will make sure that those are seen by everyone and saved for the record. So by 5 p.m. tomorrow, which would be March 19th. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And then just as a reminder, looking at the calendar, our next meeting is April 1st. That's a 5:30. Then April 15th is a 6:30 start. And then May 6th is a 5:30 start. So take a look at those and get them on your calendar. All right. Anything else from anyone? Would someone like to move to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
I moved and seconded to adjourn this meeting. Thanks, everybody. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. We will see you on April 1st. Thank you.